Christy Martin had always been an amazing athlete, but the boxing ring was where she shined the brightest.
I actually got involved in boxing back in 1987 while I was in college. I thought, wow, this is so exciting. The adrenaline rush, the crowd response, I was just hooked.
So in the winter of 1990, 22-year-old Christy was excited when her promoters set up a meeting in Bristol, Tennessee, with a professional trainer named Jim Martin.
I didn't know anything about him, had never heard of him before. I thought, well, what the heck?
But the encounter left Christy disheartened.
I went into the gym the first day. Jim was like rude to me. You just knew, you could just feel it, that he didn't want a woman in his boxing gym.
Christy was disappointed by Jim's initial reaction, but his refusal to sign her only fueled her ambition to succeed.
The next day she came back and wanted more, and she came back the following day.
I was always there, day after day, whatever time I was supposed to be there, I was always there giving 100%. He never said anything, but I could just feel there was a change.
Just weeks after they first met, Jim had a change of heart, and he agreed to take Christy under his wing.
The light came on in his head that, wow, she can make a lot of money, and I should hold on to her.
And over the next few weeks, Christy focused solely on her training sessions with Jim. The two spent nearly every minute together.
We trained hours together, and then maybe we'd get something to eat. I didn't know a lot of people there. He didn't know a lot of people there, so we kind of bonded.
Christy soon realized she and Jim had developed feelings for each other. And before long, she found herself revealing a very personal secret.
I told him the truth. I said, you know, I've had relationships with women. I just talked to him and trusted him. This is my coach. This is somebody that's an older person. This is somebody that I can trust.
There was one woman in particular who held a special place in Christy's heart. Her name was Sherry Lusk, and she was an old friend from Christy's hometown.
When I told Jim, he was just like, well, that was then, this is now.
It appeared Jim wasn't about to let Christy's past stop him from being romantically involved in her future.
After one of my fights, he kissed me. You know, as time went on, there was definitely something romantic involved there.
The new couple seemed happy, and in the fall of 1992, Jim asked Christy to marry him. The two moved to Florida and wed at a local courthouse.
I think that I had that love for Jim that you have for a teacher, somebody that you respect. On my wedding day, it felt like if I married him, you know, I will grow to love him, I'll figure it out.
But the truth is hard to bury, and 18 years later, just when Christy was ready to face it, she was sucker punched.
I told Jim, I'm gonna work out, but I just had this terrible, terrible headache. I'm just gonna have to lay down.
I didn't realize the extent of Christy's unhappiness and the control that went on behind closed doors.
And he said, I have something to show you, and I see he has a knife.
Christy had 49 professional wins in the ring, and I think all of those paled in comparison to this.
By the summer of 1993, Christy Martin and her professional boxing trainer, Jim Martin, were still adjusting to their year-old marriage.
The beginning of the marriage with Jim, the love that I had for Jim was more of a respect thing. It was just, when can we fight? You know, how much money are we gonna make?
Christy knew the couple's income was solely dependent on her professional career.
I mean, Jim trained me, but trainers make 10%. And without me, he doesn't have someone to train. The income in my marriage was me. It was my blood, sweat, and tears.
To further complicate matters, Christy had been open with Jim about her preference for women, something Jim did not want to discuss. But if marriage didn't seem to come naturally for the couple, boxing more than made up for it.
Often Jim would be asked in an interview about Christy, risking her life in the ring. And he would always take a deep breath and get choked up he'd become very emotional.
I always tell everybody I didn't think I'd be kissing one of my fighters.
I thought that he really was looking out for me. I thought at some point, I'm really gonna love this person.
While Christy waited for love, her boxing career took off. In October of 1993, she signed a deal with boxing giant Don King.
That was probably the first time that it sunk into me that I have a true shot at being a professional fighter.
Jim was very proud of Christy. I also think that he knew that the more publicity she got, perhaps the bigger payday down the road.
Christy's professional life had reached an all-time high.
I spent my time at the gym. I trained hard before, so now I really have to train like a maniac because I'm gonna be with the big guns.
As the months went on, Christy won match after match, and Christy and Jim seemed like boxing's all-star duo, especially when Don King extended Christy's contract through 2001.
Jim was very proud of how successful and how well-known Christy had become, and would take a step back and let her enjoy the spotlight.
But outside the ring, Christy's relationship with Jim had taken an alarming turn. It began with a series of surprising threats.
Anything he could find to hurt me, he would, whether that be professionally or personally. It started out from the beginning that he would tell everybody in the boxing world I've had relationships with women.
Jim went on to claim that Christy's sexual preferences could ruin her career. Terrified of losing everything, Christy severed ties with her old flame, Sherry Lusk.
We talked every Christmas. That was our tradition. Until the Christmas I called, and she said, I can't talk anymore. Jim won't let me talk to you. And from that minute on, I knew this girl was in a very, very bad place.
Christy felt completely trapped. And by 2005, any connection she once had with Jim was fading fast.
Jim really never made me feel positive because he was always tearing me down. He had me convinced that my family hated me, the boxing world hated me. He was always the controller, and I was always the controlled, and it never changed.
Christy barely recognized the man she had once trusted. But the lowest punch of all came in the form of a videotape.
Jim had been videotaping me secretly. I found a videotape of us having sex. And so he blackmailed me with the videotape. He was gonna show them to my family, to the boxing community. Basically, I'm gonna use these tapes to keep you here. And I was definitely panicked. My fear was just embarrassment. I didn't want other people seeing me having sex with him.
It was very, very ironic. Christy could be so vicious in the ring, yet she was so submissive and meek in her relationship with her husband.
By 2007, 15 years into their marriage, Christy was completely backed into a corner, just where Jim seemed to want her.
I was miserable. I hated him. I hated the marriage. Divorcing him wasn't really gonna be enough because he was still gonna be here walking around with me and I wouldn't feel safe.
Christy's battle with Jim was far from over. In fact, the most violent fight of her life was just around the corner.
I begged her not to go. I begged her to do anything but go home.
If Jim couldn't control her in life, Jim could control her in death.
He was gonna give me a little bit more rope, and then either I was gonna hang myself or he was gonna hang me.
By the spring of 2007, professional boxer Christy Martin was having a tough go of it. Jim Martin, her husband and boxing trainer of 16 years, had resorted to threats and intimidation to keep Christy under his control.
He would tell me, you're not leaving me, I'll kill you. And now I've lived my life, so what do I care about going to jail? Basically, I just kept looking at how am I gonna get out.
Terrified of her husband and with her boxing career winding down, Christy felt she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And that March, Jim came home with what he called a quick fix.
Jim came in from the gym, and he brought in some cocaine. He said that somebody from the gym had given it to him. I've been an athlete all my life. I 100% have been against drugs. So I just left it there. I just sat there for a couple days.
But before Christy knew it, she began to have second thoughts.
It was just miserable. And I thought, well, maybe, I'll give it a try and we'll see what happens.
Christy tried the cocaine, and before long, she was a daily user with Jim as her supplier.
I kept taking cocaine because it was an escape. I mean, this is so not who I am, but I just had given up.
Christy's drug addiction was now just another way for Jim to control her.
Jim controlled the coke. I stopped going to the gym. Every night was just a sex night, and if I refused, then the cocaine would disappear. So basically, you agree to do anything.
By the spring of 2010, Christy and Jim Martin were on the verge of bankruptcy, and Christy had hit rock bottom. But that March, Christy's nightmare began to change. It all started when an old friend found Christy on a social networking site.
On the side, it popped up, people we suggest you should be friends with. And there was Christy Martin. I immediately hit her name and said, how are you doing? And would you like to be friends? Her response was classic. Is that what they call it these days?
It was just surprising and good to hear from her.
Christy was thrilled to learn Sherry also lived in Florida, and only about 2 hours away. Sherry had always held a special place in Christy's life, and it wasn't long before the two old friends were having a heart-to-heart over the telephone.
And I just opened up and told her, miserable, this marriage is gonna kill me.
Christy's reconnection with Sherry gave her the motivation to get clean. It also spurred her to break things off with Jim.
I just told him, you train me and we'll live under the same roof. Let's try to make some money, get ourselves out of this financial situation that we're in. Once we get back even, you go your way and I'm going mine.
To Christy's surprise, Jim seemed to agree with her plan.
There really wasn't much of a response. I felt like he had realized I can't hold this woman any longer.
The following weekend, Christy invited Sherry to dinner. But that evening, when Christy arrived, she got a disturbing phone call.
The minute she got there, she hugged me and the phone rang. She answered the phone and I could loudly hear Jim saying, I see you and I see the way you greeted her.
Had Jim been following her? Furious, Christy told Sherry she needed to confront Jim and tell him she was leaving right then and there.
And when she got in her car, she looked at me and her last words to me is, this mother's gonna shoot me.
On November 23rd at 4 p.m., Christy entered her house, ready to end her relationship with Jim. But a sudden migraine drove her to her bed instead. Meanwhile, Jim began making phone calls.
While I'm laying there, he gets on the phone. He's saying negative things about me. He won't quit talking loud. The entire time that I'm laying down, I can hear him sharpening his knife.
Christy wasn't sure what Jim was up to, so she called Sherry for support.
I heard Jim enter the room, and he came to her and said, I have something to show you.
He keeps trying to talk to me. I'm like, Jim, I'll be right in there to see what you have as soon as I finish this conversation with Sherry.
As soon as Christy hung up the phone, she saw the surprise Jim had in store.
So I kind of leaned to the side so now I can see behind his back. And I see he has a knife down in his shorts. And then he stabbed me.
As Jim repeatedly plunged a knife into her, Christy attempted to use her fighting skills against the man who had trained her. But Jim was ruthless.
He stabbed me the fourth time, right in my breast. He cut my calf muscle almost completely from my leg. And I just told him, I said, you cannot kill me.
Christy was determined to live, but Jim seemed intent on making sure she didn't. And the worst was yet to come.
How could he let me live? He can't trust me. He better not trust me.
And Christy said that she wasn't going to die in her house and she wasn't going to die on Jim's terms.
I heard the water turn on in the bathroom, so I knew it was my only chance.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong, go to investigation.discovery.com. On November 23, 2010, Christy Martin was engaged in the fight of her life. Her estranged husband Jim had just stabbed her multiple times. But Christy, a professional boxer with a new outlook on life, was determined to survive.
I was trying to get away from him. I just remember begging him and telling him, my parents have been good to you. Don't make them bury their child. He was beating my head on the ground. He was beating my head on the dresser. I'm just laying on the floor, bleeding to death. He would come in and out, in and out. I guess he was seeing if I was dying fast enough.
The final time Jim came back into the bedroom, he brought something that would surely finish the job.
He stood right at my feet and shot me with my own 9mm.
The bullet entered Christy's chest less than 4 inches from her heart. Leaving his wife for dead, Jim went into the bathroom to clean up. But he underestimated his wife's resolve. 4 stab wounds and a gunshot couldn't stop Christy.
And I heard the water turn on in the bathroom, so I knew it was my only chance. So I got up, the gun was laying there, so I grabbed the pink 9mm, and then I just ran out the front door as fast as I could get out.
With a fighter's determination, Christy made it to the open road and flagged down a passing car.
And I got in his back seat, and I told him I'd been shot and stabbed by my husband, and please hurry, don't let me die.
The driver took Christy straight to the hospital. She had narrowly survived a gunshot wound and several stabbings. But Christy's biggest scar wasn't physical.
The hardest thing for me to come to grips with, I think, is how Jim did this to me. I mean, he left me for dead. He thought I was dead.
Even worse was the fact that Jim Martin was still on the loose, hiding out from police who were on a desperate search to find him.
1 week after the attack, Jim was found in some person's backyard in a pair of shorts and a knife in his hand covered in a bloody rag.
Jim was immediately arrested and charged with attempted first-degree murder. While he sat in jail awaiting his trial, Jim pled his innocence. Across town and against all odds, Christy was released from the hospital.
I wasn't gonna let him win. I was in the hospital only 7 days.
And on April 23, 2012, Jim and Christy headed to court.
Christy has portrayed throughout her entire career strength, perseverance, doing the right thing. And Christy had to take that witness stand and talk about the exact opposite, which was the real reality of her life. And the worst part about it was that she had to do that 30 feet from the person who tried to kill her.
He felt like he owned her. He felt like everything Christy was a product of his making, his teaching, his doing. His property had disobeyed him, and he was going to teach it and punish it.
Just 4 days later, on April 27th, a jury convicted Jim Martin of attempted second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in a state prison.
I am free, literally free. I can do what I want, be where I want to be, and it's a feeling I haven't had for a long time.
Today, Christy Martin has a new lease on life.
It's very important for me to tell my story because I feel like people, they have to think, how in the world can this woman, a fighter, how could she have been in a relationship where she was so controlled? And so if it can happen to me, it can happen to anybody.
Christy is also back in the gym and realizes throwing punches was the best medicine.
Why did I go back to boxing? Because I love it. And it was the best therapy that anybody could have ever prescribed for me.
Catherine Blankenship wasn't about to let a major milestone pass her by.
I went to Bunkie High School in Bunkie, Louisiana, and in 2007 I was planning our high school reunion.
That April, after reaching out to several old classmates, Catherine received a surprising email from a former student named Glenn Seymour.
The email surprised me because that was the last person I had expected to hear from. It was out of the blue.
Catherine hadn't seen or spoken to Glenn since the 8th grade, when he had dropped out of school.
Glenn in middle school was quiet. He really kept to himself. We knew of each other, but we weren't considered friends.
But the junior high cliques were far behind them, and Catherine marveled at how much Glenn seemed to have changed.
He told me when he got old enough, he went into the Marines, that he was working for Homeland Security. He would go all across the United States. He would protect people. I thought it was very admirable for someone to do such an amazing job for his country. It touched my heart.
Glenn told Catherine he lived nearby, where he shared custody of his daughter from a previous relationship. Catherine was a single mother herself.
We connected on that level right away. The phone calls between Glenn and I would last hours, sometimes up until I had to go to work the next morning. To have that connection with someone is wonderful.
Before long, the new couple had become inseparable. And as Glenn regaled Catherine with tales of his military prowess, she found herself becoming more and more impressed.
When Catherine told me about Glenn's background in the Marines and then into Homeland Security, I thought, well, Catherine's found somebody that's going to be good, you know.
I saw the display of all the service medals, military medals, the military certificates. I was amazed. So it verified that he was an outstanding man.
As the weeks went by, Glenn and Catherine spent the majority of their time together. And in August of 2007, 4 months after Glenn's first email, Catherine was excited to learn she was pregnant.
Glenn's response to me being pregnant, after about 2 minutes of being shocked, he was very, very happy to have another child on the way. Glenn suggested that he and I moved in together. The decision to move in together was easier than figuring out what soda you wanted to drink for the day. It just fit.
Catherine and Glenn seemed destined for each other, and just 1 month later, Glenn proposed.
I was excited. He seemed brave. He was an outstanding father. He seemed wonderful.
But sometimes the battlefield is hard to leave behind. Just 2 years later, Catherine Blankenship would find herself in the middle of a very different kind of war. In July of 2009, Catherine and Glenn came home to an alarming sight. Their front yard was swarming with uniformed men.
We were watching the house, and Glenn Seymour arrived. We asked if we have permission to search the house.
Guns were everywhere in the house. They were loaded.
Catherine was bewildered. "What is this about?" she said. "Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you."
And that's when Catherine's world changed forever.
Well, I said, I don't think something's right there.
It's just a horrific chain of events, all because of Glenn Seymour's actions.
In the fall of 2007, Catherine Blankenship and her fiancé Glenn Seymour were newly pregnant with the couple's first child. Glenn's job kept him away from home more than Catherine would have liked, but she didn't complain.
Glenn said he worked Homeland Security while his cover was offshore as an electrician. Glenn worked a typical offshore rig in the Gulf, which was 14 days home and 14 days at work.
Catherine loved everything about her hard-working husband. But as fall gave way to winter, Catherine realized there was one thing about Glenn that made her rather uncomfortable.
Glenn had a massive gun collection. He said some of it was for his Homeland Security job, some was passed down from his grandfather, and some was just because he liked them. He was infatuated with guns. Just about every time he had a free moment, he was either cleaning it, taking it apart, cleaning it, rearranging them. I made Glenn promise me that he would keep them locked up in the gun cabinets and the key put away to where nobody could get access to them, especially my kid.
Glenn promised to keep his guns under lock and key. And in March of 2008, the safe and happy couple welcomed their first child into the world.
Glenn was amazing. When he was home from work, he let me sleep. He'd get up for the midnight feedings, the midnight changings. He wanted to make sure that he didn't miss a moment in our son's life.
He was good. Glenn, as a father, he was loving. He fed, he changed diapers. He would carry the baby with him when he'd go uptown to the video store, show off the baby. He was a proud father.
That July, when Glenn and Catherine married, it seemed like the final piece of the puzzle.
We were both excited, ready to start that next chapter in our lives. I've been married and divorced. He's been married and divorced. This was the one that's going to stick.
1 month later, Catherine learned she was once again pregnant. But the blissful days would soon be over, as Glenn's past came back to haunt him in a most disturbing way. In March of 2009, Catherine woke up to Glenn screaming in the bed beside her. She tried to wake him up, but Glenn was sound asleep.
He finally woke up and I asked him what was going on, and he told me, he said it was just a flashback.
Glenn explained his flashbacks were terrible dreams from his days fighting on the battlefield.
He said he couldn't explain or talk about what they were. He said they were just about the past, and he'd just leave it at that. So it really scared me.
If Glenn's night terrors weren't enough, his old combat injuries had also started to flare up.
Glenn would often speak of being in pain, which was bad headaches from being injured in the Marines while on duty, being hit with shrapnel in the head.
Glenn already had a doctor's prescription for both pain and anxiety medications. Catherine hoped the pills would be enough to get her husband through his trauma.
I was glad that he was on them, because as long as he's getting help and relief, then it worked, so I was happy with that.
But on May 28, 2009, Catherine came home to an alarming sight.
I had some pain pills in my purse from after I had our child, and I found him digging in my purse for my pain pills. I asked him what he was doing in my purse. He said he was looking for a pen. There was a box of pens on the counter. So after he left, went to another room, I went and got my pain pills, and I hid them.
But a few weeks later, when Catherine went to retrieve her pills from their hiding place, they were gone.
Because I was hurting really bad, and found that they were replaced with an over-the-counter pain reliever. I was highly, highly upset.
Glenn would come here and ask me if I had pain pills. I told Catherine about it, and Catherine couldn't believe it.
I confronted him right away about it. He, of course, denied it over and over. He denied it. He was busted, so I just didn't talk to him for the rest of the day. I didn't want to have any more argument. I just wanted to try to let it go.
Catherine worried that her husband had become an addict, but she was about to find out that Glenn's prescription drugs were the very least of their problems.
There was a lie somewhere, and we didn't know where to begin.
Catherine was bewildered. Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you.
It seemed like my whole world fell apart.
By May of 2009, Catherine Blankenship was deeply worried about her husband, Glenn Seymour.
Glenn was on 2 types of prescription pills, one pain pill for shrapnel in his head, and the other pill was anti-anxiety for his flashbacks.
Glenn had been showing signs of addiction, but Catherine was determined to give her husband the benefit of the doubt, until a shocking turn of events changed everything. On July 22, 2009, Catherine and Glenn were returning home from a shopping trip with the children.
We pull up at our house and we see dozens of men standing outside.
The men appeared to be local police officers and U.S. Marshals.
I didn't know what to think. Glenn had often spoke of his job in Homeland Security, that if somebody shows up at the house, ask him certain questions, you don't say nothing because you don't know nothing.
Glenn assured a nervous Catherine that everything was fine.
He seemed calm. He didn't seem worried. When he went up to the gentleman, I figured something happened and they was just maybe trying to get his side of the story. Finally, I got out to go see what was wrong because I was worried. I didn't know what was going on.
But before Catherine could reach her husband, police officers stepped directly in her path.
We approached Catherine and asked her about searching the house. Catherine was bewildered. "What is this about?" she said. "Why are you doing this to him? He's one of you."
The guy asked me if Glenn had a badge. I informed him yes. He asked me if I knew where the badge was. I told him yes. So I walked the guy inside the house. I went to the bedroom where it was last, and the badge wasn't there.
Catherine had a million questions, and she would soon get some very disturbing answers as officers sat her down at her kitchen table and explained why they were there.
Glenn had walked into a pharmacy. Glenn was hoping to get prescription pills, pain medication from this pharmacist without going to visit a doctor. Glenn had said he was a United States Marshal. This was caught on video. Glenn was dressed in SWAT attire and also stated that he had injured himself in the training and he needed pain relief immediately.
The pharmacist had not given Glenn his pills and had quickly called 911. Glenn Seymour's name was turned over to law enforcement, and they immediately started doing some digging.
We did his background investigation, determined that no law enforcement agency that we contacted had him in employment.
Officers discovered that while Glenn Seymour was an offshore oil rig electrician, he was not, nor had he ever been, a Homeland Security officer.
The moment that the officer told me that Glenn was never Homeland Security, it seemed like my whole world fell apart. My whole marriage was a lie.
I could tell that Catherine was basically taken by Glenn Seymour with his lies. I explained to Catherine that Glenn Seymour was not an officer of the law and that we had certain items in his house that we want to look for. She was very compliant. She signed a consent to search.
And as soon as I signed the paper, 5 guys rushed in the house and they started taking everything that belonged to Glenn.
Catherine watched in tears as the real officers carried Glenn's belongings right past him, where he sat handcuffed on the front lawn and flanked by police.
No way in the world did I expect to find what we uncovered. We retrieved tens of thousands of dollars worth of weapons, what people would deem assault weapons, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition. Glenn Seymour also had homemade suppressors, which are silencers that mostly people use to muffle the sound of a rifle.
When one of the officers came from down the hall with a gun in his hand, I asked him where he got it from. He said it came from the nursery closet behind a duffel bag. The guns in the nursery where my baby sleeps. That dropped my heart.
Officers also gathered up the military plaques and medals Catherine had been so proud of.
So I go back out and make initial contact with Glenn Seymour. And my basic question to Glenn Seymour was, "You're a Marine?" And Glenn Seymour's answer was, "Yes, I was, but I was honorably discharged because of my wounds." And he pointed to his head area. And there was no scars, no marks to prove it. And I brought that to his attention.
And that was all it took for Glenn to finally reveal the truth.
Glenn broke down crying. He said, "I've never been in any armed forces. Those medals were from a dead Marine that died in a car wreck. And I ordered the certificates and dog tags offline." So my stomach just kind of sunk. Glenn Seymour was living a life of lies, and his wife was buying into it.
By this time, I didn't know what was real, what was lies, what happened, what didn't happen. I didn't know what to think.
Glenn Seymour was placed under arrest for impersonating a federal law enforcement agent. But before police put Glenn in a squad car, Catherine was given 5 minutes to talk to her husband.
He finally told me, he said, "I'm just so sorry. We'll figure it out when I get home."
Catherine was desperate for answers, and she knew that things looked bad for her husband. But Catherine had no idea how much worse things were about to get.
That phone call destroyed everything.
It was a blow to all of us.
I think Glenn thought it was the end, and he took a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong, go to investigation.discovery.com. On July 22, 2009, Catherine Blankenship was shocked when her husband, Glenn Seymour, was arrested for impersonating a law enforcement officer. But when Glenn called her from jail, he insisted he was innocent and blamed the police.
He said the cops are lying. I constantly asked him what was going on. He just didn't know. He had no clue. He wouldn't tell me anything. At the end of that conversation, I still felt like everything was unresolved. So I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. but my gut was telling me not to.
Catherine wasn't sure she could trust her husband, especially when she found out he was giving federal agents an entirely different story.
Glenn admitted to over 100 impersonations of a police officer where he tried to gain some sort of favor. I think Glenn was thinking, I know I'm in trouble now. I think he was remorseful for it. I think he was remorseful for getting caught.
After 2 days in jail, Glenn was released on bail while he awaited trial.
I told Glenn when he got home from jail, as long as I knew everything and he'd be honest with me, then we could work on getting our marriage back on track. And he looked me in the eye and told me that I knew everything and there was no more secrets.
But Catherine kept pushing until her husband finally told her the devastating truth.
He said he was not in the Marines. He tried going and he failed the hearing test. Told me he didn't understand why he lied. He just wanted it so bad. That's something that he has always wanted in his heart and soul. So he thought that if he lied about it so long, that he would believe it.
Even though Glenn's entire past was made up, Catherine was still willing to stand by her husband.
I still loved him. I loved the man he was to me and the kids. The lies that Glenn told to me didn't make him the person he is. That didn't matter to me. That's not the man that was my husband, the father to my kids. I don't care if he was in Homeland Security or not. That's not the man I fell in love with. That's just something from the past.
Catherine and Glenn vowed to move forward. But as the days went by, Catherine realized putting the past behind them was going to be easier said than done.
He still made comments about he needed to get his guns back. He didn't feel like a man because he didn't have his guns to protect his family. I tell him, you don't need guns to protect your family. As long as you're here, that's protection. He didn't believe it.
Although Catherine was ready to forgive Glenn, the state of Louisiana wasn't as willing. Glenn would face 10 to 20 years in prison if convicted. So Catherine suggested that Glenn return to work to clear his head. But when he arrived back on the oil rig, Glenn found that news of his phony career had traveled fast.
Glenn called me, and he was about in tears. I could hear it in his voice. He was so embarrassed because there were two guys over there making fun of him. He said he felt like less of a man. I told him, men can be boys. You're a bigger person than that. Don't worry about it.
The heckling got the best of Glenn. 2 days later, Catherine got a heartbreaking phone call from the oil rig.
It was one of his bosses from work told me that Glenn had passed away. He had hung himself. And they tried to revive him. There was nothing that they could do. I was still in love with him. When I got that phone call, it seemed to really confirm all the lies that he couldn't live with anymore. I felt like my world just crashed.
Catherine and those investigating Glenn's case will never really know why Glenn created such a tangled web of lies.
Impersonating a Homeland Security special agent or Marine is a serious crime. I asked, why would you do this, Glenn? And he just said, I wanted my kids to look up to me. I want to be a hero to them. My basic answer to them is, Glenn, just plain food, just plain shelter. You are a hero to them.
I would often tell Glenn that being in the service isn't the reason I loved him, isn't the reason I fell in love with him. He was a wonderful father, husband. He worked for us. He lived for us. Being in the service, that didn't matter.
Today, Catherine Blankenship pours her energy into her children and takes things one day at a time. Although she feels ready to move forward, Catherine is not thinking about romance just yet.
I wish Catherine would find somebody to make her happy. She deserved it.
I'm single. I'm not dating. I figure whenever time is right, I'll be blessed with that person.
And when that time comes, Catherine will have learned a thing or two about trust.
I've learned that if your gut tells you something's not adding up, no matter what it is, check it out. You save yourself a whole lot of heartache that way.
The heat in East Texas doesn't just sit on you. It hunts you. It is a physical weight, a wet, suffocating blanket that presses down on the pine forests and the asphalt roads until the world feels like it is holding its breath, waiting for something to break. On the night of August 14th, 1998, in the quiet, church-going town of Vidor, that heat was oppressive, thick with the static of an approaching storm that never seemed to arrive. The air tasted of ozone and dry dirt. It was the kind of night where secrets fester, where windows are left open in a desperate bid for a breeze that never comes, and where the safety of a locked door becomes nothing more than a fragile illusion. In the suburbs, the blue flicker of television sets illuminated living rooms, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. People were asleep, or close to it, lulled by the rhythmic thrum of ceiling fans and the distant, lonely whistle of a freight train cutting through the dark. But at 2:14 a.m., the silence of Oakwood Drive was not broken by thunder, but by a sound far more primal, far more terrifying. It was a scream, sharp, jagged, and abruptly cut short. It was the sound of a life being extinguished, a sound that would echo in the nightmares of this community for 25 agonizing years. This is where our story begins, not with a solution, but with a question written in blood. Who walked into the home of 24-year-old elementary school teacher Sarah Jenkins and simply erased her existence? The call came into the Orange County Dispatch at 2:21 a.m. A neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins, whose insomnia often kept her staring out at the empty street, reported seeing a shadow. Not a man, she would later insist to the responding officers, but a shadow, something fluid and shapeless that detached itself from the darkness of Sarah's porch and dissolved into the treeline. The first patrol car arrived 7 minutes later. The red and blue lights slashed through the humidity, painting the manicured lawns in strobes of panic. Officer Miller, a rookie with only 6 months on the force, was the first to step onto the porch. The front door was unlocked. It wasn't kicked in. The frame wasn't splintered. It was just slightly ajar, a dark mouth gaping open, inviting the horrors of the night inside. Miller would later describe the smell. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood that hit him first. It was the smell of everyday life interrupted. The scent of vanilla candles, fresh laundry, and something else, something wrong. As he pushed the door open, his flashlight beam cut through the gloom of the hallway. Photos on the walls smiled back at him. Sarah at graduation, Sarah at the beach, Sarah holding her newborn niece. Frozen moments of a future that had just been stolen. He called out her name. Police. Ms. Jenkins. His voice bounced off the walls, hollow and unanswered. The silence in that house was heavy, a dense, pressurized vacuum. He moved deeper, his hand resting on his holster, the floorboards creaking under his boots like the groan of a dying animal. The living room was undisturbed. A book lay open on the coffee table, a half-drunk glass of iced tea sweating onto a coaster. It was a tableau of a quiet evening. But as Miller turned the corner toward the bedroom, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, charged with violence. The bedroom door was closed. He turned the handle. It was locked from the inside. With a deep breath, he kicked it. The wood gave way, with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. What Officer Miller found in that room would become the first image in a collage of horror that would haunt the Texas Rangers for decades. Sarah was there, but the scene was chaotic, a whirlwind of struggle confined to a 10-by-10 space. The lamp was shattered. The curtains were torn down, pooling on the floor like shrouds. And Sarah. Sarah was gone. Not missing, but gone from the world of the living. The violence inflicted upon her was personal, frenzied, a release of rage, so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a chilling precision. No fingerprints on the doorknob. No muddy footprints on the carpet. It was as if a phantom had manifested in the room, unleashed hell, and then evaporated. The next 12 hours in Vidor were a blur of yellow tape and hushed whispers. The coroner's van backed into the driveway, a stark white hearse for a girl who had taught half the town's children how to read. The sun rose on August 15th, revealing the ugliness of the tragedy in the harsh light of day. The neighbors gathered behind the police barricades, their faces pale, eyes wide with the realization that the monster was not a story on the news. It was here, breathing their air, walking their streets. The shock was immediate and visceral. This was a town where people left their keys in the ignition and their back doors unlocked. That innocence died alongside Sarah Jenkins that morning. Detectives swarmed the property. They combed through the grass on their hands and knees, looking for a fiber, a hair, a drop of sweat, anything. They found nothing. The shadow Mrs. Higgins had seen had left no trace. The ground was dry. The drought had turned the earth into concrete, refusing to hold a footprint. Inside, the forensics team dusted every surface. The black powder coated the house in a layer of grime, turning the sanctuary of a home into a sterile crime lab. They lifted prints, but they all belonged to Sarah or her parents who had visited the week before. They bagged the bedsheets, the torn curtains, the shattered lamp. Every item was a potential voice for the voiceless victim, but for years, those items would remain silent. The community shock transformed rapidly into fear. Locks were bought out at the local hardware store by noon. Fathers sat on their porches with shotguns across their laps as the sun went down. The rumor mill began to churn, grinding innocent names into dust. Was it the ex-boyfriend who had moved to Houston? Was it the quiet drifter who worked at the gas station? Was it a neighbor? The police interviewed everyone. They knocked on every door within a 3-mile radius. They looked into the eyes of grieving friends and terrified strangers, searching for a flicker of guilt, a twitch of deception. Captain Jim Sterling, a veteran detective with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too much, took charge of the investigation. He stood in the center of Sarah's bedroom, staring at the empty space where the bed had been. He knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Sarah's purse was on the kitchen counter, untouching. Her jewelry box was full. This was a hunt. Someone had wanted her, specifically her. They had watched. They had waited. They had known her routine. The violation was the motive. Sterling felt the weight of the cold case label hovering over him even then, a specter he tried to beat back with sleepless nights and endless coffees. Days turned into weeks. The flowers piled up on the lawn of the Jenkins house began to wilt, turning brown and brittle in the Texas sun. The sensational headlines in the local papers, "Teacher Murdered in Bed, Phantom Killer Stalks Vidor," began to slide from the front page to page 3, then page 5. The tips slowed down. The hotline, once ringing off the hook with hysterical sightings and well-meaning guesses, fell silent. The police had a timeline, they had a victim, and they had a cause of death. But they had no suspect. They had no DNA profile, at least not one they could use in 1998. The technology wasn't there. They had samples, microscopic specks of biological material found under Sarah's fingernails, a desperate final act of defense. But in 1998, that was just a biological puzzle with no key. The investigation hit a wall, a solid, impenetrable wall of silence. Sterling and his team re-interviewed the inner circle. The boyfriend, Mark, was cleared. He had been on an oil rig in the Gulf, surrounded by 50 witnesses. The creepy janitor at the school was cleared. He was in a drunk tank in a neighboring county that night. Every lead that looked promising unraveled upon closer inspection, dissolving like smoke. The frustration in the precinct was palpable. It was a physical tension, a tightening of jaws and clenching of fists. They knew the killer was out there. They felt him. He was likely watching the news, seeing his handiwork discussed, perhaps even laughing at their incompetence.
The seasons changed.
The oppressive heat of August gave way to a mild, gray autumn. The yellow tape came down. The house on Oakwood Drive sat empty, a hollow skull with dark windows, stared at by children riding their bikes who dared each other to touch the mailbox. Sarah Jenkins became a ghost story, a cautionary tale told to teenagers to keep them from staying out too late. "Don't end up like Sarah," parents would say, the cruelty of the phrase masked by fear. But for the detectives, she wasn't a story. She was a file box, then 2 boxes, then 3. As the millennium approached, the case went cold. Officially cold. The file was moved from the active desk to the bottom drawer and finally to the archives in the basement, a graveyard of justice. But cold case is a deceptive term. It implies a lack of heat, a lack of activity. But for the family of the victim, and for Detective Sterling, the case was never cold. It burned. It burned with the white-hot intensity of injustice. Every time Sterling ate a slice of pizza, every time he drove past a school, every time he saw a young woman with brown hair, he thought of her. He thought of the monster who had slipped away into the treeline. The years dragged on. 2005, 2010, 2015, the world changed. Phones lost their cords, the internet connected the globe, and forensic science made quantum leaps. The term DNA went from a buzzword to a magic bullet. But the Texas 1998 sample remained tricky. It was degraded, mixed, a complex puzzle that the standard Cody's database rejected time and time again. No match found. The computer screen's blinking cursor mocked them. The killer had lived a clean life, it seemed. He had never been arrested for a felony, never had his swab taken. He was a ghost in the system, just as he had been a ghost in the night. But the silence of a cold case is not empty. It is pregnant with waiting. While the files gathered dust, the world of genetic genealogy was being born. A new weapon was being forged, not in a police lab, but in the databases of ancestry websites where people searched for long-lost cousins and built family trees. The detectives didn't know it yet, but the key to unlocking the mystery of Oakwood Drive wasn't in the crime scene photos or the witness statements. It wasn't in the interrogations or the hunches. It was hiding in the future, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, and the right mistake. And criminals, no matter how careful, no matter how disciplined, are human. They eat, they drink, they discard, they grow complacent. They believe that time is a shield, that 20 years is a lifetime, that the night of August 14, 1998, has been forgotten by God and the law. But they are wrong. Time is not a shield. It is a trap. And in this story, the trap was set not with a gun or a badge, but with something incredibly mundane, something so trivial it borders on the absurd. A piece of trash, a discarded remnant of a Tuesday lunch, a pizza crust. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the capture, we must understand the darkness that preceded it. We must understand the 20-year void where a killer walked free, perhaps sitting in the pew next to Sarah's mother at church, perhaps bagging groceries at the local market. The terror of the cold case is not just the unsolved murder, it is the proximity of the murderer, the knowledge that he is here. And as the calendar pages turned, and the hope of the community dwindled to a flicker, a new generation of investigators decided to pull the boxes from the basement. They decided to blow the dust off the file marked Jenkins, 1998. They decided that the ghost of Vidor had haunted them long enough. The reopening of the case wasn't announced with fanfare. It was a quiet decision made in a sterile office by a new sheriff who looked at the photo of the young teacher and felt that same burning injustice Sterling had felt decades prior. They had one shot. One tiny, microscopic shot. The sample from under the fingernails. It was the only physical tether they had to the killer. If they used it up, if they destroyed it in testing without a result, the case would be dead forever. It was a gamble. A high-stakes poker game with a ghost. And they were about to go all in. The gamble was not just about science. It was about the sanctity of memory. To consume the last physical remnant of Sarah Jenkins was to risk erasing the only undeniable truth left in the case. If the test failed, if the sample was too degraded or the mixture of DNA too complex for the new machines to unravel, then the killer would win. He would win not just his freedom, which he had enjoyed for decades, but he would win the ultimate victory: obscurity. He would fade into the tapestry of American history, just another faceless boogeyman in a land crowded with them. But to do nothing was a slower kind of death. It was a surrender to the entropy of time, an admission that justice had an expiration date. And in Vidor, Texas, where the pine trees grow tall and memories run deep, surrender was a word that stuck in the throat like a fishbone. The years between the murder and this decision were not merely a vacuum of silence. They were a graveyard of hope. We must understand the texture of those years to understand the magnitude of the breakthrough. For Sarah's parents, Martha and Bill, time did not heal. It calcified. The first Christmas without her was a blur of phantom limbs, a table set with one less plate, the air thick with the unspoken. Then came the first anniversary, marked by a candlelight vigil where the wax dripped onto the pavement like tears. Then the 5th, then the 10th. The reporters stopped calling. The detectives stopped visiting. The case file, once a living, breathing entity on the captain's desk, migrated to the cold case unit, which was less of a unit and more of a dusty corner in the basement archive, illuminated by a flickering fluorescent bulb that buzzed like a trapped fly. Detective Sterling, the man who had stood in Sarah's bedroom that first night and felt the chill of the killer's presence, retired in 2008. He didn't want to go. He wanted to be the one to click the handcuff shut. He kept a copy of Sarah's driver's license photo taped to the visor of his personal truck. He drove past the crime scene on his way to the grocery store, on his way to church, on his way to nowhere. He became a ghost haunting the living, his eyes scanning the crowds at high school football games, wondering if the man cheering for a touchdown was the same man who had climbed through that window. Sterling's obsession cost him his first marriage. It cost him his sleep. It cost him his peace. When he handed in his badge and gun, he handed over the weight of the Jenkins case to a younger generation, but he never truly put it down. He took it home with him, a heavy stone in his pocket that he turned over and over with trembling fingers. There were false dawns, of course. Cruel mirages that shimmered in the desert of the investigation. In 2004, a serial rapist was caught in Louisiana, a man who targeted teachers. The modus operandi was similar, the stalking, the entry, the violence. Vidor held its breath. The Texas Rangers drove across state lines, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They sat across from the man in an interrogation room that smelled of stale coffee and fear. They grilled him for hours. They showed him Sarah's picture. He laughed. He denied it. And when his DNA came back, it was a mismatch. The air went out of the balloon. The community slumped back into its fearful crouch. It was a roller coaster that only went down, a plunging descent into disappointment that left everyone nauseous. Then came the era of silence. From 2010 to 2018, the case was effectively dead. The technology of the time, STR analysis, the standard CODIS database, had done all it could. The killer wasn't a convicted felon, or at least, not one who had been swabbed. He was a phantom, a cipher. He was the man who held the door open for you at the post office. He was the man who fixed your air conditioning. He was nobody and he was everybody. This is the unique horror of the stranger-on-stranger crime. Without a connection, without a jealous ex-husband or a disgruntled employee, the suspect pool is the entire human race. The detectives were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they didn't even know what the needle looked like. They didn't know if it was sharp or dull, rusted or shining. They were groping in the dark, and the dark was vast. But while the police work stalled, the world was shifting under their feet. A revolution was happening, not in the crime labs, but in the living rooms of suburbia. People were spitting into tubes. They were sending their saliva to companies with cheerful names, hoping to find out if they were Irish or Italian, hoping to connect with a second cousin in struggle. They were building a massive, global library of human genetic code, voluntarily, eagerly, without realizing they were constructing the greatest dragnet in the history of criminal justice. Millions of profiles were uploaded. Family trees were stitched together with digital thread. The concept of privacy was being rewritten, and for the cold case detectives, this was the dawn of a new age. The Golden State Killer arrest in California was the thunderclap that woke the world up. It proved that you didn't need the killer's DNA in the database. You just needed his third cousins. It was against this backdrop that the new lead investigator, Ranger Elias Thorne, decided to take the gamble. Thorne was a different breed than Sterling. He was younger, sharper, a man who trusted data more than gut instinct. He looked at the degradation of the sample not as a barrier, but as a challenge. He contacted a private lab, one of those cutting-edge outfits that operated out of a nondescript business park in Virginia, places where geniuses in white coats did things with algorithms that bordered on sorcery. He had to fight for the budget. He had to fight the district attorney who was terrified of ruining the evidence for a future trial that might never happen. Thorne argued that a trial without a defendant is a fantasy. He slammed his hand on the desk. "We are chasing a ghost with a net made of mist," he said. "Let me use the radar." The approval came on a Tuesday. A rainy Tuesday, much like the night Sarah died. The sample, a tiny, precious vial containing the genetic residue of a monster, was packed into a cooler with the reverence of a holy relic. It was shipped overnight. And then, the waiting began again. But this was a different kind of waiting. It wasn't the passive, hopeless waiting of the last decade. It was the tense, electric waiting of a hunter in a blind. Thorne checked his email every hour. He checked it in the middle of the night. He checked it at traffic lights. He knew that somewhere in Virginia, a sequencer was humming, reading the A's, C's, T's, and G's that made up the killer's blueprint. They were building a profile. Not a name, but a map. The results didn't come back as a single sheet of paper with a mugshot. Real life isn't a movie in that way. The report that landed in Thorne's inbox 3 months later was a labyrinth. It was a list of distant relatives. Third cousins twice removed. People who had never been to Vidor, Texas. People who lived in Oregon, in Maine, in London. It was a genetic constellation, scattered and dim. The killer was in there, somewhere, hiding in the branches of a family tree that had been pruned by time and migration. This is where the real work began. This was not police work. This was genealogy. This was dusting off birth certificates from the 1950s, reading obituaries from small-town newspapers, deciphering marriage licenses written in cursive by clerks who had been dead for 50 years. Thorne brought in a specialist, a genetic genealogist named Elena. She worked remotely, a digital detective who lived in databases. She took the list of distant cousins and began to work backward. She looked for the common ancestors. Great-grandparents who had lived in the 1920s. She built the tree down, branch by branch, generation by generation. It was tedious, eye-straining work. It was a process of elimination. This branch moved to Canada, dead end. This branch had only daughters, dead end. This branch ended in a tragic car accident in 1980, dead end. She was looking for a male who would have been in his 20s or 30s in 1998. A male who had ties to Southeast Texas. Weeks turned into months. The cold case board in Thorne's office became covered in a new kind of web, not photos of the crime scene, but printouts of family trees. Lines drawn in red marker connected names. It looked like a conspiracy theorist's wall, but it was the architecture of truth. And then one afternoon the phone rang. It was Elena. Her voice was trembling. She had found a convergence. 2 branches of the family tree, separated by geography and time, had intersected in a small town just outside of Beaumont, 20 minutes from Vidor. A marriage in 1965. A divorce in 1972. And a son. A son who had no social media presence. A son who had no felony record. A son who had vanished into the beige anonymity of the working class. His name was Kenneth. Kenneth Lee Mathers. Thorne wrote the name on a yellow legal pad. He stared at it. The letters looked innocuous. Kenneth. It was a soft name. A normal name. It didn't sound like a monster. Thorne typed the name into the police database. Nothing criminal. A few speeding tickets in the 90s. A divorce in 2005. An address listed in a trailer park on the outskirts of town, in a place where the roads turn to dirt and the cell service dies. Thorne felt a chill race down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This was him. He felt it with a certainty that defied logic. The geography fit. The age fit. The silence fit. But a name on a notepad is not a conviction. A genetic lead is not a warrant. You cannot arrest a man because his third cousin spat in a tube and an algorithm thinks he might be related to a murder. They needed proof. They needed his DNA. But they couldn't just ask for it. If they tipped him off, if Kenneth Mathers knew they were watching, he would run. Or he would lawyer up. Or he would destroy evidence. They had to catch him being human. They had to steal his essence without him knowing it was gone. They had to become shadows, just as he had been a shadow on that porch 25 years ago. The surveillance team was assembled under the cover of darkness. Unmarked cars. Plainclothes officers who looked like construction workers, like tourists, like anyone but cops. They set up a perimeter around the trailer park. It was a desolate place, a collection of rusted metal boxes sitting on cinder blocks, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the carcasses of old cars. Mathers' trailer was at the end of the row, a faded blue structure with aluminum foil covering the windows. A fortress of solitude. Thorne sat in a van 100 yards away, watching through high-powered binoculars. He saw a flicker of movement behind the screen door. A silhouette. The objective was clear. Trash. They needed his trash. But Mathers was paranoid. Or maybe just careful. He didn't put his bins out on the curb like everyone else. He burned his trash in a rusted barrel in the backyard. Thorne watched the smoke rise, gray and acrid, carrying the potential evidence up into the atmosphere where it could never be retrieved. Every time Mathers struck a match, Thorne cursed. They were so close, yet an impenetrable wall of fire stood between them and the truth. They needed a mistake. They needed him to leave the sanctuary of that trailer. They needed him to enter the public world, where he had no expectation of privacy and where the police were the apex predators. For 3 days, Mathers didn't leave. He was a recluse, a hermit living on the fringes of society. The surveillance team was exhausted. They were peeing in bottles and eating cold sandwiches, their eyes burning from staring at the blue trailer. Doubt began to creep in. What if the genealogist was wrong? What if this was just another dead end, another innocent man whose life they were about to invade? But Thorne held the line. "Wait," he commanded. "Everybody eats. Everybody leaves." And then, on the 4th day, the door opened. Kenneth Mathers stepped out. He was older now than the Phantom of 1998. His hair was gray and thinning, his belly paunched over his belt buckle. He wore a stained t-shirt and work boots. He didn't look like a killer. He looked like a grandfather. He looked like a man who was tired. He walked to an old, beat-up Ford pickup truck, the kind that rattles when it starts. He threw a tool bag in the back. He started the engine. A cloud of black exhaust coughed out of the tailpipe. Thorne spoke into his radio, his voice calm but tight as a bowstring. "Target is mobile. Stay loose. Do not burn him. I repeat, do not burn him." The convoy of unmarked cars peeled away from the curb, slipping into traffic behind the Ford. They followed him down the highway, keeping a distance, trading positions so he wouldn't notice the same car twice. Mathers drove slowly, obeying the speed limit, using his turn signals. He was driving toward the city, toward people, toward opportunity. Thorne's heart was pounding a rhythm against his ribs. "Sarah," he thought. "We're coming." The hunt had moved from the digital world back to the physical one. The ghost had taken form. And now, all they needed was for him to discard something. A cigarette butt, a gum wrapper, a straw. Anything that had touched his lips, his hands, his skin. Mathers pulled into the parking lot of a strip mall. He didn't go to a bank. He didn't go to a hardware store. He parked in front of a pizza place. Little Tony's Pizza. A local joint, busy, crowded. Thorne watched as Mathers got out of the truck and walked inside. The smell of baking dough and pepperoni wafted out the door. It was lunchtime. The detectives parked across the street, their eyes glued to the glass storefront. They saw Mathers walk up to the counter. They saw him order. They saw him pay with cash. He didn't take it to go. He sat down. He sat at a small booth near the window alone. Thorne signaled his team. 2 undercover officers, a man and a woman posing as a couple, exited their vehicle. They were wired for sound. They walked into the pizza place, laughing, holding hands, acting out a scene of domestic normalcy, while their minds were razor-focused on the man in the corner booth. They sat 2 tables away. They ordered drinks. And they waited. They watched Kenneth Mathers eat. It was a surreal, grotesque vigil. Watching a murderer consume a meal, knowing that the biological code that would send him to death row was being transferred from his saliva to the crust of that pepperoni pizza. Every bite was a step closer to justice. Every wipe of his mouth with a napkin was a prayer answered. Mathers ate slowly. He looked out the window, watching the traffic go by. What was he thinking? Was he thinking about the heat? About his job? Or was he thinking about a girl in a bedroom 25 years ago? Did he feel the eyes of the law on him? Or did he feel safe, wrapped in the blanket of time? He finished the first slice. Then the second. He picked up the third. The undercover officers held their breath. If he took the trash with him, if he bussed his own table, they would have to confront him. They would have to create a scene. It had to be abandoned. It had to be discarded property. Mathers finished the third slice. He left the crust. A thick, gnawed piece of dough, glistening with oil and saliva. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin and crumbled it into a ball, dropping it onto the red plastic tray. He stood up. He patted his stomach. He didn't look at the trash. He turned and walked toward the door. The chime rang as he exited. The undercover officer waited 5 seconds that felt like 5 years, and then stood up. He walked over to the table, not as a cop, but as a guy looking for a chair. But his hand moved with the speed of a magician. He produced a sterile evidence bag from his jacket pocket. With a gloved hand, he snatched the pizza crust and the napkin. Zip. Sealed. Outside, in the van, Thorne watched the officer give the signal. A subtle nod. It was done. They had the sample. The ghost was in the bag. The hunt was over. The science was about to begin its final, damning judgment. And as Mathers' truck disappeared down the road, driving back toward his trailer and his anonymity, he had no idea that he had just left his freedom on a plastic tray in a pizza parlor. The countdown had started. The silence of a cold case was about to be shattered by the roar of the truth. The plastic bag sat on the passenger seat of Detective Thorne's unmarked sedan like a ticking bomb, though it made no sound. Inside, the half-eaten remains of a pepperoni pizza slice and a crumpled, grease-stained napkin were no longer refuse. They were the most valuable objects in the entire state of Texas. To a casual observer, it was trash. To Thorne, it was the ghost of Sarah Jenkins, finally answering the door. The drive from the strip mall to the state crime lab in Houston was a blur of white-knuckled tension. Every pothole felt like a threat, every red light an agonizing delay. Thorne found himself checking the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting Mathers to be behind him, to somehow know that his genetic soul had been stolen, but the road behind was empty, shimmering in the midday heat waves. The handover at the lab was executed with the solemnity of a religious rite. The chain of custody log was signed, the time stamped, 1:42 p.m. The lab technician, a woman named Dr. Eris who had processed more rape kits and murder weapons than she cared to count, took the bag with gloved hands. She didn't smile. She knew the stakes. She knew that 25 years of agony were condensed into the saliva on that crust. "Rush it," Thorne said, his voice raspy from lack of water. "I need to know yesterday." Dr. Eris nodded. "You'll know when the science knows, Detective." And then she disappeared behind the swinging double doors, taking the hope of Vidor with her. For the next 48 hours, time didn't just slow down, it warped. It bent around the waiting, distorting reality. Thorne went back to the office, but he couldn't focus on paperwork. He stared at the whiteboard, at the name Kenneth Mathers written in red. He traced the letters with his eyes, memorizing the shape of the enemy. The surveillance team remained on the trailer park, watching a man who was now, in their minds, a dead man walking. They reported his movements. He watered his pathetic patch of lawn. He smoked on the porch. He watched TV. The banality of evil was on full display. It was infuriating to watch him live such a mundane existence, while Sarah Jenkins lay in a cold grave, her potential stolen, her future erased. Every time Mathers laughed at something on his porch, it felt like a personal insult to the investigation. Inside the sterile, humming world of the crime lab, the process was clinical, devoid of emotion, yet utterly definitive. The technicians swabbed the crust. They extracted the cells left behind by Mather's lips and tongue. They spun the sample in a centrifuge, separating the DNA from the grease and the cheese. Then came the amplification, copying the specific markers, the short tandem repeats, the unique genetic barcode that distinguishes one human being from another. It is a process of mathematical certainty. There is no guessing. There is no maybe. The machine reads the peaks and valleys of the genetic landscape, turning biology into data. And then, the comparison. The computer pulled up the profile from the 1998 crime scene, the degraded, stubborn sample from beneath Sarah's fingernails that had taunted them for decades. It placed it side by side with the profile from the pizza crust. The call came at 3:14 a.m. on a Thursday. Thorne was awake, sitting in his living room in the dark, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. The phone buzzed on the armrest, the screen lighting up the room like a sudden lightning strike. He knew. Before he even answered, he knew. He picked it up, his hand steady, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs.
"Thorne," he said.
"It's Eris." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, but Thorne could hear the underlying frequency of triumph. "We have a match." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. "We have a match." For words that dismantled 25 years of mystery. For words that vindicated Mrs. Higgins and her story of the shadow. For words that promised justice. How sure? Thorne asked, though he didn't need to. The probability of a random individual sharing this profile is 1 in 4.8 quadrillion, Eris recited. It's him, Elias. It's Kenneth Mathers. The markers are identical. The alleles match at every locus we tested. There is no doubt. There is no error. You have your ghost. Thorne closed his eyes and let out a breath he felt he had been holding since 1998, even though he hadn't been on the force then. He felt the weight of Jim Sterling's obsession, the weight of Sarah's parents' grief, the weight of the town's fear. All of it shifted, just an inch, but enough to breathe. "Thank you," he whispered. He hung up the phone and sat in the silence for a long moment. He didn't cheer. He didn't fist pump. He felt a profound, chilling clarity. The monster had a name. The monster had a face. And the monster was sleeping in a blue trailer 10 miles away. The next morning, the energy in the precinct was electric. It was a controlled frenzy. Thorne briefed the captain and the district attorney. The evidence was laid out. The genealogy tree, the surveillance logs, and the crown jewel, the lab report with the astronomical statistics. The district attorney, a woman known for her caution, looked at the papers and her eyes widened. 1 in a quadrillion, she muttered. You could convict God with these numbers. The warrant was drafted immediately. But this wasn't just an arrest warrant. It was a tactical operation. They weren't going to knock on his door and ask him to come quietly. This was a man who had killed with brutal efficiency. They didn't know what he had in that trailer. Guns? Explosives? Hostages? They had to assume the worst. But before they could move, they had to build the narrative. The who was solved, but the why and the how were still murky. Thorne and his partner, Detective Alvarez, spent the next 12 hours dissecting the life of Kenneth Mathers in 1998. They pulled old employment records, tax filings, DMV photos. They needed to place him at the scene, not just biologically, but physically. They needed to understand the intersection of their lives. In 1998, Kenneth Mathers was 26 years old. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a criminal. He was a delivery driver for a local appliance warehouse. Thorne stared at the employment file. Appliance delivery. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They delivered refrigerators, washing machines, dryers. They went into people's homes. They walked through front doors, into kitchens, into laundry rooms. They saw layouts. They saw who lived alone. Thorne grabbed the phone and called the company archives. The business had changed hands twice, but the records were digitized. He requested the delivery logs for August 1998. The clerk on the other end complained about the request, about the dust, about the time. Just find it, Thorne snapped. This is for Sarah Jenkins. The name still carried weight in Vidor. The clerk went silent and went to work. 2 hours later, A fax came through. A grainy, scanned copy of a delivery manifest from August 12th, 1998, 2 days before the murder. Delivery 1400 block of Oakwood Drive. Item: washer/dryer set. Customer: Sarah Jenkins. Thorne stared at the signature at the bottom of the invoice. Driver: K. Mathers. There it was. The connection. The fatal intersection. It wasn't random. It wasn't a shadow from the trees. Kenneth Mathers had been in her house. He had walked through her front door with a dolly and a washing machine. He had seen her. He had spoken to her. She had probably offered him a glass of water, because that's the kind of person Sarah was. And in that brief, professional interaction, something dark had sparked in Mathers' brain. He had seen a young woman living alone. He had seen the layout of the house. He had seen the lock on the back door. He had cased the joint while she smiled and signed the receipt. The predator had been invited in. This revelation changed the profile completely. It wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense. It was a crime of fixation. He had stewed on it for 2 days. He had gone back to work, delivered more appliances, all the while replaying the layout of her house in his mind, fantasizing, planning. The cooling-off period before he even struck. It made the crime infinitely more calculated, more sinister. He knew exactly where he was going. He knew exactly which window to watch. Armed with this new knowledge, the tactical team finalized the plan. They wouldn't raid the trailer. A raid in a trailer park was a recipe for disaster. Thin walls, stray bullets, too many innocent bystanders. They would take him in transit. They knew his routine now. Every Friday evening, Mathers drove to a gas station on the corner of Highway 12 and Main to buy a carton of cigarettes and a 6-pack of beer. It was clockwork. That was the kill zone. Friday, 5 p.m. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the Texas sky in hues of bruised purple and orange. The heat was still rising from the asphalt, creating mirages on the highway. Thorne sat in the command vehicle, a converted SUV parked half a mile down the road. "All units, check in," he whispered into his radio. Alpha 1 in position, came the voice from a sedan parked at the gas station pumps. Bravo 2, covering the exit, said another. Charlie 3, we have eyes on the trailer. Target is moving. He's getting in the truck. Thorne watched the GPS tracker they had magnetically slapped onto Mathers' bumper the night before. The dot on the screen began to move. It crawled down the dirt road of the trailer park, turned onto the main road, and picked up speed. "Here we go," Thorne muttered. "Stay calm. Let him commit to the stop." The Ford pickup truck rattled down the highway, oblivious to the net tightening around it. Mathers was listening to the radio, perhaps thinking about his weekend, about the beer he was going to drink. He had no idea that his past was rushing up to meet him at 70 miles per hour. He signaled left. He turned into the gas station. He pulled up to pump number 4. He turned off the engine. "Wait for him to exit the vehicle," Thorne commanded. "I want him away from the weapon if he has one." Mathers opened the door. He stepped out. He stretched his back. He reached for his wallet. "Go. Go. Go," Thorne shouted. Suddenly, the sleepy gas station erupted. 4 unmarked cars screeched into the lot, blocking the exits, blocking the truck. Sirens wailed, a deafening, disorienting shriek. Doors flew open. Officers in tactical vests poured out, weapons drawn, their voices overlapping in a wall of sound. "Police, get on the ground. Show me your hands.
Down. Down.
Down." Mathers froze. He looked up, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of shock. For a second, he looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't run. The sheer, overwhelming force of the moment paralyzed him. He was a man waking up from a 25-year dream to find a nightmare staring him in the face. Officer Alvarez was the first to reach him. He tackled Mathers, taking him to the pavement hard. "Hands behind your back. Do it now." The air was thick with adrenaline and dust. Thorne ran up, his badge swinging from his neck. He watched as the cuffs were slapped onto Mathers' wrists.
Click. Click.
The sound was sweeter than any music Thorne had ever heard. Mathers was hoisted to his feet. He had a scrape on his cheek, bleeding slightly. He looked bewildered, blinking rapidly. He looked at Thorne. And in that moment, the years fell away. Thorne didn't see an old man. He saw the shadow. He saw the predator. "Kenneth Mathers," Thorne said, his voice cutting through the noise of the sirens. "You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Jenkins." Mathers didn't speak. He didn't scream. He just stared. And then, a look of resignation washed over his face. The look of a man who had been waiting for this tap on the shoulder for a quarter of a century. He slumped, his body going limp in the officer's grip. The secret was out. The burden was gone. They walked him to the back of the patrol car. The blue and red lights reflected off the gas station windows, illuminating the faces of the stunned customers who had frozen mid-pump. Thorne watched Mathers duck his head to enter the vehicle. The door slammed shut. The barrier between the monster and the world was finally re-established. Thorne pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he had memorized. It rang once.
Twice.
"Hello." The voice was frail, trembling. It was Martha Jenkins, Sarah's mother. "Mrs. Jenkins," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion he tried to suppress. "It's Elias Thorne. We got him. We got him, Martha." There was silence on the other end. Then a gasp. Then the sound of weeping, raw and guttural. The sound of a dam breaking after 25 years of holding back the flood. Thorne let her cry. He stood in the gas station parking lot, the sirens fading, the sun setting, and listened to the sound of a mother's grief finally finding a landing place. The cold case was burning hot, but the arrest was just the beginning. Now came the interrogation. Now came the game of cat and mouse in a concrete room. Now came the truth. Thorne looked at the patrol car as it pulled away. "Don't get comfortable, Kenneth," he whispered to the retreating taillights. "We have a lot to talk about." Back at the station, the interrogation room was being prepped. The cameras were checked. The chairs were bolted to the floor. The air conditioning was cranked up, making the room frigid. They wanted him cold. They wanted him uncomfortable. They wanted him to feel the walls closing in. Thorne walked into the observation room and looked through the one-way mirror. Mathers was sitting there, his hands cuffed to the table, staring at the blank wall. He looked small. He looked pathetic. But Thorne knew better. Inside that mundane shell lived a darkness that had destroyed a family. Thorne adjusted his tie. He picked up the file, the thick, heavy file that contained the autopsy photos, the crime scene sketches, the pizza crust report, and the delivery invoice. He took a deep breath. He was about to walk into a room with the devil. He put his hand on the doorknob. The metal was cold. He turned it. The door opened with a heavy thud. Mathers didn't look up. Thorne walked in, pulled out the chair opposite him, and sat down. He placed the file on the table between them. He didn't speak for a long minute. He just let the silence stretch, let it become a physical presence in the room. He stared at Mathers until the man was forced to lift his eyes. "Hello, Kenneth," Thorne said softly. "Do you remember the spin cycle? Or was it the rinse cycle that was running when you decided to come back?" Mathers' eyes flickered. A tiny, involuntary twitch. "I know everything," Thorne lied, leaning in. "But I want to hear you say it. I want you to tell me about the pizza. And I want you to tell me about Sarah." The air in interrogation room B is not just cold. It is chemically sterile, scrubbed of all comfort, designed to make a human being feel small, exposed, and utterly alone. The fluorescent lights overhead hum with a low, maddening frequency, a sound that seems to burrow into the skull after an hour. Kenneth Mathers sits in the metal chair, his wrists cuffed to the table, the steel biting into his skin. He is slumped, his shoulders rounded, a posture of defeat, or perhaps a posture of camouflage. He is trying to look harmless. He is trying to look like a confused grandfather who has been dragged into a nightmare by mistake. But Detective Thorne, sitting across from him, sees only the predator. He sees the man who watched a young woman die and then went on to live a quiet life for 25 years. Thorne does not yell. He does not slam his fist on the table. That is Hollywood. That is for amateurs. Thorne knows that silence is the loudest noise in the world to a guilty man. He opens the file folder slowly, deliberately. He smooths out the edges of a photograph. It is not a crime scene photo. It is a picture of Sarah Jenkins, alive, smiling, standing in her classroom in front of a chalkboard. He slides it across the table, face up. Mathers doesn't look at it. He stares at a scuff mark on the linoleum floor, his jaw working silently, grinding his teeth. "Look at her, Kenneth," Thorne says, his voice a low rumble. She was 24. She taught second grade. She had a cat named Buster. She liked iced tea with extra lemon. Mathers flinches. Just a tiny movement, a tightening of the eyes. He keeps his gaze averted. "I don't know who that is," he mumbles.
His voice is gravelly, dry.
"I don't know why I'm here. I didn't do nothing." Thorne leans back, crossing his arms. "You didn't do nothing," he repeats, tasting the lie. That's an interesting choice of words. Most people say, "I didn't kill anyone." You say, "I didn't do nothing," as if your entire existence is a void. But you did do something, Kenneth. You did a lot of things. You drove a truck. You delivered appliances. You walked into people's homes. Mathers shifts in his chair. The mention of his old job pricks his ears. He looks up for the first time, his eyes watery and pale. "I was a driver. Lots of guys were drivers. That was a long time ago." August 1998, Thorne says, locking eyes with him. "A very hot summer. You remember the heat, don't you? It makes people leave their windows open. It makes them careless." Thorne reaches into the file again. He pulls out the copy of the delivery invoice. He places it next to Sarah's picture. August 12, 1998. 2 days before she died. You were there. 1400 block of Oakwood Drive. You delivered a washer and dryer. You signed for it. She signed for it. Mathers stares at the paper. He sees his own signature. A younger man's scrawl, loopy and rushed. He sees Sarah's signature, elegant and precise. The physical proof of their meeting lies between them on the metal table, undeniable as a tombstone. The stranger, defense evaporates in the harsh fluorescent light. He can no longer claim he never met her. He can no longer claim he wasn't in Vidor. The paper trails of the modern world are the chains that bind him. I might have been there," Mathers stammers, his voice gaining a defensive edge. "I delivered to hundreds of houses. You think I remember one girl from 25 years ago? I was just doing my job. I put the machine in, I plugged it in, I left. That's it. That's all I did." Thorne nods slowly, feigning agreement.
Right. You did your job.
You went into the laundry room, which is right off the kitchen, isn't it? And to get to the laundry room, you have to walk past the living room. You have to walk past the hallway that leads to the bedroom. You saw the layout, didn't you, Kenneth? You saw that she lived alone. You saw that the back door had a flimsy lock. You saw a target. I ain't a pervert. Mathers snaps, a sudden flash of anger breaking through the facade. I'm a working man. I don't look at people's houses like that. I delivered the damn washer, and I left. Ask anyone. I never had a complaint. We did ask. Thorne lies smoothly. We talked to your old boss. He said you were quiet. A little too quiet. He said you liked the routes near the schools. He said you sometimes took longer on deliveries than you should have. Thorne is pushing buttons now, probing for the weak spots in Mathers' psyche. He needs to crack the shell of normalcy Mathers has built around himself. He's a liar. Mathers spits. Everyone's a liar. Sarah wasn't a liar, Thorne says softly. She was a teacher.
She was kind.
Did she offer you water, Kenneth? Did she smile at you? Did you think that smile was for you? Did you think she wanted you? Mathers goes silent again. His breathing is heavier now. The air in the room feels thick, pressurized. He is remembering. He can't stop it. The memory of that afternoon is flooding back. The smell of the new appliance, the sound of her voice, the way the sunlight hit her hair. He had felt invisible that day, just a delivery boy, a piece of furniture. But later, in the dark, he had made himself visible. He had made himself the center of her world. I wasn't there that night, Mathers says, his voice dropping to a whisper. I was home. I was with my wife. Your ex-wife. Thorne corrects him. We talked to her, too. She said you went out a lot at night. She said you liked to drive around to clear your head. She said you came home late that night and washed your clothes immediately. Why did you wash your clothes at 3 a.m., Kenneth? Were they dirty? Or were they stained? Mather's face drains of color. He is realizing the scope of the investigation. They haven't just grabbed him off the street. They have dissected his life. They have peeled back the layers of his history. But he still has one card to play. He clings to the belief that they don't have physical proof. He thinks this is all circumstantial. He thinks they are fishing. I didn't kill her, Mather says, leaning forward, his eyes pleading. I swear to God. I delivered the washer. That's it. You got a receipt?
Fine.
I was there on Tuesday. But I wasn't there on Friday. You can't prove I was there on Friday. This is the moment Thorne has been waiting for. The you can't prove it moment. It is the trapdoor that criminals always walk onto, thinking it is solid ground. Thorne allows a small, grim smile to touch his lips. He stops looking at the file. He looks directly into Mather's pupils. Science doesn't care about your swear words, Kenneth. God might forgive you, but science just points a finger. Thorne reaches into his pocket. He doesn't pull out a gun. He pulls out a plastic evidence bag. Inside is a photo of the pizza crust. You like pepperoni, don't you? Thorne asks conversationally. Little Tony's Pizza. You ate there yesterday. You sat by the window. You watched the world go by. You thought you were safe. You thought 25 years was a shield. Mather stares at the photo. He looks confused. So what? I ate pizza. Is that a crime now? It is when you leave your DNA on the crust, Thorne says, his voice hardening into steel. We took that crust, Kenneth. We took it to the lab. And do you know what we found? We found you. But we didn't just find you in a pizza parlor. We found you somewhere else. Thorne stands up now. He looms over the table, casting a shadow over Mathers, mimicking the shadow that fell over Sarah Jenkins. He walks around the table, standing behind Mathers, his voice coming from above, like the voice of judgment itself. We found your DNA under her fingernails, Thorne whispers into Mathers' ear. She fought you, didn't she? She scratched you. She took a piece of you with her when she died. She held on to it for 25 years, waiting for us to find it, waiting for us to find you. The silence that follows is absolute. It is the silence of a vacuum. Mathers stops breathing. The air leaves his lungs and refuses to return. His world, constructed of lies and evasion, shatters into a million pieces. The stranger defense is gone. The delivery-only defense is gone. The DNA is the anchor that drags him down to the bottom of the ocean. No, Mathers whispers. It is a weak, pathetic sound. That's impossible. I was careful. I wore. He stops himself. He catches the slip just before it falls off the precipice of confession. You wore what? Thorne pounces, circling back to the front of the table. Gloves? Did you wear gloves, Kenneth? Maybe you did. But you missed a spot. Or maybe they ripped. Or maybe, in the heat of the struggle, when you were strangling the life out of a girl who had done nothing but offer you kindness, she reached out and grabbed your arm. She scratched you. And you didn't even notice. You were too busy enjoying the power. Mathers is shaking now. His hands are trembling so violently that the handcuffs rattle against the table. I want a lawyer, he croaks. I want a lawyer. You can have a lawyer, Thorne says, sitting back down. But a lawyer can't change your DNA. A lawyer can't change the fact that your skin was under her nails. We have the match, Kenneth. 1 in 4 quadrillion. That's a number so big the human brain can't even comprehend it. It's you. It's always been you. And everyone is going to know. Your kids. Your grandkids. The neighbors. They're all going to know that the quiet man in the trailer was a monster. Thorne leans in close, his face inches from Mathers. But here's the choice you have left. Just one choice. The jury is going to see the monster. Do you want them to see a man who is sorry? Or do you want them to see a cold-blooded killer who lies until the very end? Because right now, the needle is in your arm, Kenneth. You can help yourself, or you can let the state of Texas do what it does best. Mathers puts his head in his hands. He begins to rock back and forth. The facade of the grandfather is gone. The facade of the delivery driver is gone. All that is left is the raw, exposed nerve of guilt. He starts to mumble, incoherent at first, words tumbling out in a stream of panic. I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to. She looked at me. Thorne stays silent. He signals to the mirror. Recording.
Get this.
She looked at you? Thorne prompts gently. When you went back that night. Tell me about the night, Kenneth. Tell me how you got in. Mathers lifts his head. His eyes are red, rimmed with the horror of the memory he has kept locked in a box for nearly 3 decades. The back door, he whispers. The lock was cheap. I used a credit card. It popped right open. I just wanted to watch her sleep. That's all. I didn't go there to kill her. I swear. You went into her bedroom. Thorne guides him.
Yeah.
The door was open. She was sleeping. She looked like an angel. The moonlight was coming in through the window. I stood there. I just watched. But then, the floor creaked. She woke up.
She saw me.
She started to scream. Mathers' voice pitches up, cracking. She wouldn't stop screaming. I told her to shut up. I told her I wouldn't hurt her if she'd just shut up. But she kept screaming. So you stopped her, Thorne says. I put my hand over her mouth. She bit me. She fought like a wildcat. She was strong. Stronger than she looked. We fell onto the bed. The lamp broke. It was dark. I couldn't see. I squeezed. I just wanted her to stop screaming. I just wanted the noise to stop. Mathers is crying now, ugly, snot-nosed sobbing. When she stopped, she didn't move. I turned on the light. I saw her eyes. They were open, staring at me. Thorne listens, his face a mask of professional detachment, but inside, his heart is racing. This is it. The confession. The details that only the killer would know. The broken lamp. The struggle. The bite. And then what did you do? Thorne asks. I ran. Mathers sobs. I ran out the back. I drove home. I washed my clothes. I burned my shoes in the barrel. I thought if I just didn't say anything it would go away. And it did. For a long time it did. Why didn't you leave me alone? Why did you have to dig it up? Because she never left, Thorne says, standing up. She never left that room, Kenneth. Not until today. Thorne walks to the door. He knocks twice. The guard opens it. Book him, Thorne says. 1st-degree murder. As the officers come in to haul the weeping man away, Thorne steps out into the hallway. The buzz of the precinct seems louder now, more chaotic, but to Thorne, it sounds like music. He walks to his desk. He picks up a marker. He walks to the cold case board. He finds the picture of Sarah Jenkins. He doesn't take it down. He takes the red marker and writes one word across the bottom, in bold, triumphant letters, solved. But the story doesn't end with the handcuffs. The arrest is just the closing of the circle for the police. For the town of Idor, for the family, and for the history books, the shockwaves are just beginning to ripple out. The news vans are already parking on the lawn of the police station. The headlines are being typed. Cold case solved. The pizza crust killer. The sensationalism is about to take over. But in the quiet moments before the media storm, Thorne picks up the phone to make one last call. Not to the family this time, but to the retired detective, Jim Sterling. Jim, Thorne says when the old man answers. Put the coffee on. I'm coming over. And take that picture off your visor. We got him. The screen fades to black, but the voiceover continues, shifting tone. We are leaving the sterile interrogation room and moving back out into the world, where the impact of this revelation is about to tear open old wounds and offer a strange, painful kind of healing. Sound of a gavel banging. Sound of news reporters shouting questions. The trial of Kenneth Mathers would be swift. The DNA evidence was insurmountable. The confession, recorded in high definition, was damning. But the courtroom drama was not about if he did it. It was about the who. Who was this man who had lived among them? The community of Vidor had to look in the mirror. They had to reconcile the fact that the monster wasn't a drifter or a demon. He was a neighbor. He was a father. He was a man who mowed his lawn and paid his taxes. This is the true horror of the cold case. Not the mystery, but the familiarity. When the verdict was read, guilty, there was no cheering in the courtroom. Just a collective exhale. A release of tension held for 25 years. Sarah's mother, frail and gray, simply nodded. She didn't have the energy for joy. She only had the peace of knowing. Music swells, melancholy but hopeful. But what happens to a town after the cameras leave? What happens to the memory of a girl who became a headline? Sarah Jenkins was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a teacher, a friend. And as we close the file on the Texas 1998 case, we must ask ourselves, how many other pizza crusts are out there? How many other secrets are waiting in the trash? How many other ghosts are waiting for a knock on the door? The case is closed. But the echo of the scream on Oakwood Drive has finally been silenced, replaced by the whisper of justice. And somewhere in a cold evidence locker, a small plastic bag containing a piece of dried dough sits as a testament to the fact that no matter how much time passes, no matter how dark the night, the truth always has a way of rising to the surface. The news broke with the violent suddenness of a summer thunderstorm. It didn't start with a press conference. It started with a mugshot. At 6 a.m. on Friday morning, the Orange County Sheriff's Office updated their website. The image that loaded onto thousands of screens across East Texas was not the shadowy phantom of nightmares, nor was it the faceless monster that had haunted the community's collective imagination for 25 years. It was Kenneth Lee Mathers. It was a face defined by its sagging jowls, its watery blue eyes, and the confused, almost pathetic expression of a man who had been ripped from his recliner and shoved into the harsh light of accountability. For the residents of Vidor, the cognitive dissonance was deafening. This wasn't a stranger. This was the man who bought lottery tickets at the mini-mart every Wednesday. This was the man who had helped Mrs. Gable jumpstart her car in the church parking lot 3 years ago. This was the quiet guy in the trailer park who waved when you drove by. The realization rippled through the town like a tremor. The monster had been hiding in plain sight. He hadn't been lurking in the woods. He had been standing in line behind them at the grocery store. He had been breathing their air, sharing their space, absorbing their sympathy for a crime he had committed. The local news vans descended on the trailer park like vultures. They set up their satellite dishes in the dirt, training their lenses on the faded blue trailer that was now wrapped in yellow crime scene tape. Reporters shoved microphones into the faces of bewildered neighbors. "He was quiet," said one woman, clutching her bathrobe, her eyes wide with shock. "He kept to himself. He liked to garden. He grew tomatoes." How could a man who grows tomatoes kill a girl? That question, how, became the obsession of the hour. How does a man bludgeon and strangle a young teacher, leave her broken body in a shattered bedroom, and then go on to live a life of mundane normalcy? How does he wake up every morning, brush his teeth, and look at himself in the mirror without screaming? The arrest of Kenneth Mathers didn't just solve a murder, it shattered the community's trust in human nature. It forced them to confront the terrifying reality that evil does not have a specific look. It doesn't have horns. It doesn't have a glowing neon sign. Sometimes it wears work boots and drives a Ford pickup truck. But while the town reeled from the shock, a different kind of drama was unfolding inside the gray, imposing walls of the county courthouse. The legal machine had begun to turn, and it was grinding loudly. The district attorney, confident with the DNA match and the confession, moved for an immediate indictment. But the defense attorney appointed to Mathers, a sharp-eyed public defender named Marcus Hale, was not about to let his client walk into the execution chamber without a fight. Hale knew he couldn't argue with the science. He couldn't argue that the DNA didn't match. So, he did what all good defense lawyers do when the facts are against them. He attacked the process. Hale filed an emergency motion to suppress the evidence. His argument was bold, technical, and dangerous. He claimed that the police had violated Mather's Fourth Amendment rights. He argued that the pizza crust was not abandoned property because Mathers had not left the restaurant when it was seized. He argued that the undercover officer had snatched the tray before the staff had cleared it, meaning Mathers technically still had an expectation of privacy regarding his leftovers. It was a legal long shot, a desperate Hail Mary, but in the high-stakes world of capital murder, a technicality is all you need to set a monster free. The hearing was set for Monday. The tension in the DA's office was palpable. Detective Thorne, who had felt the weight lift off his shoulders with the arrest, now felt it crashing back down. If the judge ruled in favor of the defense, the DNA would be thrown out. The confession, which was obtained because of the DNA evidence, would be fruit of the poisonous tree. It would all vanish. Mathers would walk. The thought made Thorne physically ill. He spent the weekend reviewing the surveillance footage from the pizza parlor, frame by frame, watching the hand of the officer, the movement of the tray, the position of Mathers' body. He walked away. Thorne muttered to the screen. He walked away. It was trash. While the lawyers sharpened their knives, the true emotional epicenter of this earthquake was located in a small, tidy house 5 miles away. Martha and Bill Jenkins, Sarah's parents, were sitting in their living room. The room was a shrine to a life interrupted. Photos of Sarah covered the mantelpiece. Her diploma hung on the wall. For 25 years, this house had been a mausoleum of grief, a place where time had stopped in 1998. But now, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Friends, relatives, former students, everyone wanted to share in the relief. But for Martha, relief was a complicated emotion. It wasn't the joyous explosion she had expected. It was a heavy, exhausting release. It was the feeling of putting down a boulder you have carried for a quarter of a century, only to realize your back is permanently bent. He was right here, Martha whispered to Bill, clutching a tissue that was shredded in her hands. He was right here all this time. We might have seen him, Bill. We might have walked past him. Bill, a man of few words whose grief had manifested as a stoic, silent rage, stared out the window. I want to see him, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. I want to look him in the eye. I want to know if he remembers her. The police had advised against it. They said the arraignment would be a circus. They said it would be too traumatic. But Bill Jenkins didn't care about trauma. He had lived in trauma for 2 decades. He cared about witness. He wanted Mathers to know that Sarah was not forgotten, that she was not just a file number or a genetic profile. She was a daughter, and her father was still standing. Monday morning arrived with a leaden sky. The courthouse was besieged. Satellite trucks from Houston, Dallas, and even national networks lined the streets. Cold case solved flashed on the chirons. Pizza crust killer faces judge. The nickname had stuck. It was catchy, sensational, and it reduced the tragedy to a fast food anecdote. Inside courtroom 3, the air was cold and recycled. The gallery was packed. Every seat was taken. There was a low hum of conversation that died instantly when the bailiff shouted, "All rise." Judge Elena Rodriguez took the bench. She was a stern woman with a reputation for zero tolerance for theatrics. She looked at the defense table, then at the prosecution. We are here for suppression hearing in the case of the state of Texas versus Kenneth Lee Mathers, she announced. Mr. Hale, you may proceed. Mathers was brought in through the side door. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit now, his hands shackled to his waist. He looked smaller than he had in the mugshot. He shuffled. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at the cameras. And he pointedly refused to look at the front row, where Martha and Bill Jenkins sat, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Marcus Hale stood up. He was theatrical, articulate, weaving a narrative of government overreach. Your Honor, he began, pacing in front of the bench. We are on a slippery slope. If the police can snatch the food off your plate while you are still in a restaurant, where does it end? Do we have any privacy left? My client did not abandon that crust. He simply finished eating. The officer, acting as an agent of the state, committed a warrantless search and seizure of his genetic material. This evidence is tainted, and it must be excluded. The courtroom held its breath. It was a compelling argument. It played on the paranoia of the modern age. Then, the district attorney, a bulldog of a woman named Sarah, a coincidence that was not lost on the jury of public opinion, stood up. She didn't pace. She stood rooted to the floor. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the defense's fog. "Privacy ends where the public domain begins." Kenneth Mathers left that table. He turned his back. He walked out the door. He treated that crust as garbage. And the law is clear. You have no expectation of privacy in what you discard. He threw away his pizza, just like he tried to throw away Sarah Jenkins. A gasp rippled through the gallery. The objection from the defense was immediate and loud. Argumentative. Prejudicial. Judge Rodriguez raised a hand. Silence fell. She looked at Mathers, who was staring at the table. She looked at the photo of the pizza tray entered into evidence. She looked at the law books stacked in front of her. The fate of the case hung in the balance of her interpretation of the word abandonment. "I have reviewed the footage," Judge Rodriguez said, her voice echoing in the silent room. The defendant had exited the establishment. He had no intention of returning for that crust. It was trash. And one man's trash is another man's evidence. The motion to suppress is denied. A collective exhale rushed through the room. It sounded like the wind moving through the pines. Detective Thorne, sitting in the second row, closed his eyes and whispered a silent thank you. The first hurdle was cleared. The DNA stayed. The confession stayed. The trial would move forward. But the legal victory was just the opening act. As the hearing concluded and the bailiffs moved to escort Mathers back to his cell, something happened that wasn't in the script. Mathers stopped. He stopped right in front of the gallery. For the first time since his arrest, he lifted his head. He turned slowly, his chains rattling. He looked directly at Bill Jenkins. The gaze lasted only a second. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't a sneer. It was a look of dull, hollow recognition. It was the look of a man who knew he was looking at the wreckage he had caused. And then, a faint, almost imperceptible movement of his lips. He mouthed two words. "I'm sorry." Bill Jenkins didn't blink. He didn't scream. He just stared into the abyss of the man's eyes. And in that moment, Bill realized the terrifying truth that the prosecutors and the journalists missed. Mathers wasn't a monster. He was just a pathetic, broken man who had done a monstrous thing. And somehow that was worse. A monster you can hate. A pathetic man. That's just a tragedy. As Mathers was led away, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. The sketch artists furiously finished their drawings. But the real story was just beginning to emerge from the files seized from Mathers' trailer. While the lawyers argued about pizza crusts, Detective Thorne's team had been busy executing a search warrant on the blue trailer. They were looking for trophies. They were looking for Sarah's jewelry, or perhaps a newspaper clipping. They found something else. Hidden beneath the floorboards of the bedroom closet, wrapped in oilcloth and plastic bags, was a box. It wasn't a large box. It was a shoebox. Inside, there was no jewelry. There were no news clippings. Instead, there was a collection of Polaroids. Faded, yellowing instant photographs. Thorne was in the evidence room when the box was opened. He put on a fresh pair of gloves. He picked up the first photo. It was blurry, taken in low light. It showed a window. A bedroom window, seen from the outside, looking in. He picked up the second. Another window. Another house. He picked up the third. There were dozens of them. Mathers hadn't just watched Sarah. He had watched others. He was a voyeur. A prowler. For years, perhaps decades, Kenneth Mathers had been a shadow in the night, peeping into the lives of the women of Vidor. The photos were undated, the locations generic, brick walls, siding, curtains. But they were proof of a pathology that ran far deeper than a single impulsive murder. This was a lifestyle. "My God," Thorne whispered, spreading the photos out on the table. He didn't stop. He just didn't kill them. Or did he? The question hung in the air, chilling the room. The DNA had solved the Jenkins case. But now, Staring at a gallery of anonymous windows, Thorne realized the scope of the investigation had just exploded. This wasn't just about 1998 anymore. This was about every unsolved burglary, every report of a prowler, every missing woman in the Tri-County area for the last 30 years. The Pizza Crust Killer might have been a catchy headline, but the contents of the shoebox suggested a much darker, more prolific moniker was waiting in the wings.
Thorne grabbed the phone.
"Get the task force back together," he barked. "And bring me the cold case files. All of them, from 1990 to today. We have a lot of work to do." The camera pans out from the evidence room, moving through the station, out the doors, and rising above the town of Vidor. The sun is setting again, casting long shadows across the neighborhoods. Behind those curtains, people are eating dinner, watching TV, feeling safe because the killer is in jail. But the photos in the box suggest that their safety was an illusion for a very long time. The ghost had been at the window. And now, the police had to find out who else he might have visited. The investigation was no longer a straight line. It was a spiderweb. And they had just touched the center strand. The celebration in the squad room died as quickly as a candle snuffed out by a sudden draft. The champagne remained corked. The backslapping stopped. The air, previously electric with the thrill of the capture, now hung heavy and stagnant, tainted by the musk of old paper and the chemical tang of developing fluid. Detective Thorne stood over the long metal table in the evidence processing room, his hands braced on the edge, staring down at a mosaic of terror. The shoebox from the trailer had been emptied, its contents spread out like a tarot reading for the damned. There were 43 photographs. 43 Polaroids, square and white-bordered, their colors shifted by time into sickly hues of green and yellow. They were not pictures of people, at least not directly. They were pictures of boundaries being crossed. A lit bedroom window framed by the dark silhouette of a hedge. A sliding glass door left slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of a kitchen. A woman's shadow cast against a pulled shade, unaware of the lens capturing her silhouette. These were not just photographs, they were trophies of access. They were proof that Kenneth Mathers hadn't just been a killer once, he had been a phantom always. He had spent decades drifting through the backyards of Vidor, a ghost in work boots, stealing the privacy of strangers before retreating to his trailer to relive the thrill. Thorne picked up one of the photos with a pair of tweezers. It was grainy, taken in low light, but the subject was clear. A child's swing set in a backyard, illuminated by the glow of a porch light. It was innocent imagery made profane by the context. Who lived there? When was this taken? Was the child safe? The questions multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. The arrest of Mathers for Sarah Jenkins' murder was supposed to be the period at the end of the sentence. Instead, the shoebox had turned that period into a terrifying ellipsis. "We need to identify these houses," Thorne said, his voice low, addressing the small team of exhausted detectives gathered around the table. "Every single one of them. We need to know who he was watching. We need to know if he ever went inside again." The task was monumental. Vidor was a sprawling web of suburbs and rural roads. Houses built in the 70s looked like houses built in the 90s. Siding was replaced, trees were cut down, windows were upgraded. A Polaroid from 2002 might depict a house that no longer existed, or one that had been remodeled beyond recognition.
But they had to try.
They had to map the prowler's path to see if it intersected with other tragedies. Thorne assigned the task to a new unit, the identification team. They would use everything at their disposal: Google Earth, old property tax records, satellite imagery, and good old-fashioned pavement pounding. They would drive the streets of Orange County holding these pictures up to reality, looking for a matching roofline, a distinctive chimney, a unique fence. It was a needle in a haystack, but this time, the haystack was the entire county, and the needle was a potential second murder. While the team mobilized, Thorne knew he had to go back into the box. Not the shoebox, but the interrogation room. He had to face Mathers again. The dynamic had shifted. Yesterday, Mathers was a man caught in a lie about a pizza crust. Today, he was a man whose secret garden of vice had been dug up. Thorne needed to know the difference between the pictures and the kill. Was Sarah the only one who woke up? Or were there others who never got the chance to scream? Thorne walked back into the interview room. Mathers was sitting in the same position, head down, staring at his hands. The adrenaline of the arrest had faded, replaced by the crushing reality of confinement. He looked smaller, grayer. When Thorne entered, Mathers didn't look up. "We found the box, Kenneth," Thorne said. He didn't sit down. He stood by the door, letting the words hang in the air. Mathers' shoulders stiffened.
He didn't speak.
Under the floorboards, Thorne continued, walking slowly around the table. 43 pictures. 43 windows. That's a lot of nights out, Kenneth. That's a lot of creeping around in the dark while your wife thought you were clearing your head. Mathers finally looked up. His eyes were defensive, almost petulant. "That ain't illegal," he muttered. "Taking pictures ain't illegal. I didn't hurt nobody in those pictures. I just liked the way the light looked." "The way the light looked?" Thorne repeated, incredulous. He slammed a copy of one of the photos onto the table, a shot of a woman reading in a living room, unaware she was being watched from 3 feet away. "This isn't art, Kenneth. This is hunting. You were hunting them." "I never touched them," Mathers shouted, his voice cracking. "Only Sarah. Sarah was a mistake. She woke up. The others. I just watched.
I just wanted to see how people lived.
I was lonely, okay? Is it a crime to be lonely? It is when you break into their backyards," Thorne snapped. "It is when you violate their peace."
And I don't believe you, Kenneth.
"I don't believe Sarah was the only mistake. You don't go from peeping Tom to murderer and back to peeping Tom. That switch doesn't just flip off." Thorne leaned in close, his face inches from Mathers. "Who else is in that box, Kenneth? Who else didn't wake up?" Mathers clamped his mouth shut. He turned his head away, staring at the blank wall. He had given them Sarah. He felt he had paid his debt. He wasn't going to give them anything else. The harmless old man, mask was slipping, revealing the stubborn, self-preserving narcissist underneath. He viewed the photos as his property, his private collection, and he was offended that they had been taken. Thorne realized that intimidation wouldn't work on the photos. Mathers was compartmentalizing. He had separated Sarah, the accident, from the photos, the hobby. To get him to talk about the pictures, Thorne would have to change tactics. He would have to play to Mathers' ego. He would have to treat the photos with a sickening kind of respect, validating the prowler's skill to get him to reveal the locations. But outside the interrogation room, the investigation was moving faster than Mathers' silence. The leak had sprung. Maybe it was a clerk, maybe it was a cop talking too loudly at a diner, but by noon, the rumor was out. The pizza crust killer had a trophy box. The headline changed from "Case Solved" to "Serial Predator." The panic in Vidor, which had briefly subsided, flared up with renewed intensity. People weren't just checking their locks anymore. They were checking their memories. Did I hear a noise outside my window in 2005? Did I see a footprint in the flower bed in 1999? Was he watching me? The police tip line, which had gone silent after the arrest, began to ring again. But this time, it wasn't about Sarah. It was about everything else. A woman reported a man staring at her from the treeline in 2001. A father reported finding a cigarette butt under his daughter's window in 2010. The community was crowdsourcing a history of fear, stitching together 20 years of unease into a tapestry that pointed directly at Kenneth Mathers. In the lab, the identification team was scoring its first hits. A detective named Miller, a local boy who knew every street in Vidor, recognized a chimney in photo number 12. "That's the Henderson place," he said, pointing at the screen. "On Maple Street. I mowed that lawn in high school." They pulled the records. The Henderson family had lived there from 1995 to 2005. Thorne ordered a review of police calls to that address. And there it was. September 14th, 1999. Call for service. Prowler reported. Homeowner heard footsteps on the back deck. Suspect fled before arrival. It matched. The photo, the location, the police report. It was confirmation that Mathers had been there, terrorizing this family, stealing their sense of safety. But the Henderson family was alive. No one had been murdered. It fit Mathers' story, that he was just a watcher. Thorne felt a knot of frustration tightening in his stomach. If Mathers was telling the truth, if Sarah really was a one-time anomaly, then justice for her would be the end of it. But Thorne's gut, honed by years of staring into the abyss, told him otherwise. You don't stop. You don't kill once, feel the power of it, and then go back to just looking. The photos were a substitute, yes, but a substitute for what? For the kill he couldn't risk again? Or for the kills he had hidden better? Then came photo number 38. It was the most disturbing image in the collection, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. It was taken in winter. The trees were bare, skeletal fingers scratching at a gray sky. The house was a small, white frame structure with a distinctive red door. But the window in the photo was boarded up. Plywood covered the glass. Detective Alvarez, the tech specialist, ran the image through a new software program designed to match architectural features. It took 3 hours. The computer spat out a list of possible addresses. The team narrowed it down. Driving by the locations on Google Street View, they found it. A house on the outskirts of town, near the murky waters of the Neches River. The address was 404 River Road. Thorne typed the address into the cold case database. He hit enter. The screen blinked, and then it populated. A file opened. Not a burglary. Not a prowler call. Missing person: Julie N. Miller. Age 16. Last seen: November 12, 2004. Residence: 404 River Road. Thorne felt the blood drain from his face. Julie Miller, the runaway. That was how she had been classified. A troubled teen who had argued with her stepfather and stormed out the back door into the night, never to be seen again. The police had assumed she hitched a ride to Houston or New Orleans. Her case had never been investigated as a homicide. It was just a tragedy of youth. But here was her house, in Kenneth Mathers' box. Thorne grabbed the photo. He looked at the date code on the back of the Polaroid, faint but legible. October 4th. October 2004. 1 month before Julie vanished. Mathers had been watching her. He had been casing the house. He had been there in the weeds, learning her routine, learning when the arguments happened, learning when she would be vulnerable. The runaway narrative crumbled in Thorne's hands, replaced by a much darker, more sinister reality. Mathers hadn't just watched Julie. He had hunted her. Thorne didn't walk back to the interrogation room this time. He ran. He burst through the door, startling Mathers, who was sipping a cup of lukewarm water. Thorne slammed the photo of the boarded-up window onto the table. Julie Miller, Thorne said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. Tell me about Julie. Mathers blinked. For the first time, genuine fear flickered in his eyes. Not the fear of being caught, but the fear of a secret being unearthed that he thought was buried deep enough to rot. Who? He feigned. I don't know no Julie. Don't lie to me, Kenneth. Thorne roared. This is her house. 404 River Road. You were there in October of 2004. She went missing in November. You were watching her. Did you see her leave? Did you offer her a ride? Did you tell her you could help her? Mathers began to sweat. Beads of perspiration popped up on his forehead. I took lots of pictures. I don't remember names. Maybe I watched the house. So what? She ran away. Everyone knows she ran away. She didn't run away, Thorne said, leaning over the table, his shadow consuming Mathers. She ran into you. You were waiting, weren't you? You saw a girl who was upset, a girl who was vulnerable, and you saw an opportunity. You didn't break into the house this time, did you? You let her come to you. I didn't. Mathers cried, pulling at his cuffs. I didn't touch her. I swear. I just took the picture. Where's she, Kenneth? Thorne's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. Sarah is in the cemetery. We know where she is. But Julie? Julie is still out there. Is she in the river? Is she in the woods? Or is she somewhere else? Mathers shut his eyes tight, shaking his head violently. I want my lawyer. You can't prove nothing. That's just a picture of a house. That ain't proof. It's proof of intent, Thorne said. It's proof of proximity. And you know what else we're going to find? We're going to find your truck. The one you drove in 2004. We're going to strip it down to the frame. We're going to look for a hair, a fiber, a drop of blood, and we're going to find her, Kenneth. Just like we found Sarah. Thorne turned and walked to the door. He paused, his hand on the knob. You thought the pizza crust was bad? Wait until we start digging up the riverbanks. You're not going to death row for one murder, Kenneth. You're going for two. He exited the room, leaving Mathers alone with the ghost of a 16-year-old girl. The investigation had just metastasized. It was no longer a story about a cold case solved. It was a story about a serial killer unmasked. The pizza crust had opened the door, but the shoebox had blown the house apart. Thorne walked back to the bullpen, the noise of the station swirling around him. He picked up the phone. Get the dive team, he ordered. And get the cadaver dogs. We're going to River Road. The sun was setting over Vidor, but for the families of the missing, the long night was just beginning. The cold case label on the Julie Miller file was peeled off, revealing the raw, red wound underneath. The town held its breath once more, wondering how many other secrets were buried in the soil of East Texas, waiting for a picture to bring them to light. The silence of the pine forests seemed less like peace now, and more like a conspiracy. The trees knew, and Kenneth Mathers knew, and Thorne swore, as he looked at the map of the river, that he would make them both speak. The sun does not shine on River Road. It beats down. It is a relentless, physical force that turns the murky water of the Neches River into a steaming cauldron of brown sludge and secrets. The air is thick enough to chew, smelling of decaying vegetation, diesel fumes from the police boats, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. On the morning the search for Julie and Miller began, the world felt heavy, as if the atmosphere itself was trying to push the truth back down into the mud. This was no longer a cold case investigation played out in air-conditioned offices with paper files. This was a grunt operation, a war waged against the elements. Sheriff's deputies, volunteers, and Texas Rangers lined the banks, dressed in waders and sweat-stained uniforms, poking the earth with long metal rods. The sound of the search was a cacophony of shouting voices, the drone of boat engines, and the incessant buzzing of cicadas, a chorus of the dead summer heat. At the center of the chaos stood Julie's mother, trembling not from the heat, but from a chill that radiated from her very bones. For 20 years, she had told herself the runaway story. It was a painful story, yes, a story of rejection, of a daughter who chose to leave, but it was a story with hope. A runaway might come back. A runaway might be living in Dallas, might be happy, might have a child of her own. But a murder victim? A murder victim never comes back. The police activity at the riverbank was dismantling her hope brick by brick, replacing it with a horrifying certainty. Thorne watched her from a distance. He saw the way she clutched a faded photograph of Julie, the edges worn soft by 2 decades of thumbing. He knew that look. It was the look of a person standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to push them over. But while the divers groped in the blindness of the river bottom, feeling for bones among the driftwood and old tires, another hunt was happening 50 miles away, a hunt for a ghost of steel and chrome. Kenneth Mathers had not driven the same truck for 25 years. Criminals like hermit crabs changed shells. The 2004 Ford F-150, the Blue Beast as his neighbors had called it, was long gone. He had traded it in 2011 for a newer model, a white Chevy. Most people would assume the old truck was crushed, melted down, recycled into soup cans or guardrails. But in Texas, trucks don't die easily. They are sold, resold, beaten down, and eventually, they end up in the purgatory of the salvage yard, the pick and pull. Detective Alvarez had spent the night tracing the VIN. It was a digital odyssey through DMV records, title transfers, and auction receipts. The truck had had 3 owners since Mathers. A landscaper in Beaumont, a college kid in Austin, and finally, a non-operational sale to a scrap yard in Conroe. It's still listed, Alvarez had said, his eyes bloodshot from staring at the screen. It hasn't been crushed. It's in the yard. Row 42. Thorne didn't wait. He sent a flatbed tow truck and a team of forensic specialists to Conroe. They weren't going to process it there. They were bringing the entire carcass of the vehicle back to the climate-controlled lab in Vidor. They were going to perform an autopsy on a machine. When the truck arrived at the police garage, it looked like a corpse. The blue paint was oxidized to a chalky gray. The tires were flat, the rubber cracked and rotting. The windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. It smelled of mildew and old oil. But to Thorne, it was beautiful. It was a time capsule. It was the only witness to the night Julie Miller disappeared that couldn't lie, couldn't forget, and couldn't lawyer up. The processing took days. The team disassembled the truck piece by piece. They removed the seats. They pulled up the carpet. They took off the door panels. They vacuumed every square inch of the interior, collecting dust, hair, and fibers into evidence bags labeled with grid coordinates. They were looking for microscopic needles in a haystack of filth. But they didn't need a microscope for what they found under the passenger seat. It was a small, rusted metal clip. A butterfly. A cheap, glittery hair clip that a teenage girl might have bought at a mall kiosk in 2004. It was wedged deep in the mechanism of the seat track, jammed in place by years of vibration and movement. Thorne held the bag up to the light. The glitter had faded, but the shape was unmistakable. He called Julie's mother. He didn't describe it. He just asked a question. Mrs. Miller, did Julie wear hair clips? Specifically, butterflies? The silence on the other end was a scream. Yes, she whispered. Blue ones. Pink ones. She loved them. She was wearing a blue one the night she left. Thorne looked at the rusted clip in the bag.
It was blue.
The connection was made. The runaway was a lie. Julie Miller had been in Kenneth Mather's truck. She hadn't walked out of town. She had been driven out. And she had never come back. But a hair clip proves presence, not murder. A defense attorney, especially a shark like Marcus Hale, would argue that maybe Mathers gave her a ride. Maybe he was a good Samaritan. Maybe she dropped the clip and got out alive. They needed more. They needed violence. They turned to the bed of the truck. The bed liner was plastic, cracked, and stained with years of hauling mulch, appliances, and trash. They removed the liner. Underneath, the metal of the truck bed was exposed. It was scratched, rusted, and dirty. Lights out, ordered the lead CSI technician, a woman named Sarah, another Sarah in a case haunted by the name. The garage plunged into darkness. The only sound was the hum of the ventilation fans. Sarah sprayed the chemical reagent, Blue Star, a more stable, sensitive version of luminol. It hung in the air like a mist, settling on the metal. They waited. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. And then, the ghosts began to glow. A faint, ghostly blue luminescence appeared on the metal ridges of the truck bed. It wasn't a splatter. It wasn't a spray. It was a pool. A large, concentrated area near the wheel well where blood had pooled, soaked through the cracks in the liner, and stained the metal beneath. The iron in the hemoglobin, even after 20 years, was reacting with the chemical, screaming out from the past. That's not a nosebleed, Sarah whispered in the dark. That's a lot of blood. The blue light shimmered, a spectral map of a violent event. Someone had bled out in the back of this truck. Someone had been wrapped in something, perhaps, but enough fluid had escaped to leave this indelible mark. Thorne stared at the glowing stain. The hair clip placed her in the cab. The blood placed her in the grave. The narrative constructed itself in his mind with terrifying clarity. The stalking, the abduction, the struggle, the disposal. Mathers hadn't just watched the house on River Road. He had turned it into a hunting ground. The lights came back on, blindingly bright, chasing away the blue ghosts but leaving the truth exposed. They swabbed the area. Getting a DNA profile from 20-year-old blood on rusted metal would be a miracle, but miracles had happened before in this case. The pizza crust was a miracle. This was just forensics. Armed with the hair clip and the photos of the glowing truck bed, Thorne walked back to the interrogation room.
He didn't run this time.
He walked with the heavy, deliberate tread of an executioner. He had the physical evidence to bury Kenneth Mathers not just for Sarah Jenkins, but for Julie Miller and God knew who else. Mathers looked worse. The isolation was eating him. His eyes were sunken, dark circles bruising the skin beneath them. He looked up when Thorne entered, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Hope that maybe they had found nothing, that maybe the truck was clean. Thorne didn't say a word. He placed the evidence bag with a rusted butterfly clip on the table. Mathers stared at it. His breath hitched. It was a tiny sound, a sharp intake of air, but in the silence of the room, it was a thunderclap. He recognized it.
Of course he recognized it.
He had probably looked for it. He had probably wondered where it went after that night, panicked that he couldn't find it, and then convinced himself she had lost it outside. "We found the blue beast, Kenneth," Thorne said softly. "We found it in a scrapyard in Conroe. It was waiting for us." Mathers' face went gray. I sold that truck years ago." "The truck didn't forget," Thorne said. "It kept a secret for you. Right under the passenger seat." He tapped the bag. "Julie's mother says she was wearing this the night she disappeared. The night she ran away." Funny place for a runaway to leave her hair clip, isn't it? Under the seat of the man who was stalking her. "I gave her a ride," Mathers blurted out. The lie came fast, desperate, unformed. "That's it. I saw her walking on the road. She was crying. I gave her a ride to the bus station." "That's not a crime." "A ride to the bus station," Thorne repeated, nodding slowly. "That's a nice story, Kenneth. It's almost believable. A kind neighbor helping a girl in distress. But there's a problem with your story." Thorne pulled out the second photo. The glossy print of the truck bed, glowing with the eerie blue luminescence of the chemical reaction. He slid it across the table. "Why did she bleed in the back of your truck, Kenneth?" Mathers stared at the blue shape. He didn't know what it was at first, but the realization crept over him like a frost. He knew what blood looked like. He knew what he had done. "We pulled the liner," Thorne explained, his voice hard as granite. "The blood soaked through. It's been there for 20 years. It's reacting to the chemicals. That is a pool of human blood, Kenneth. A significant amount. Did she have a nosebleed on the way to the bus station? Did she cut her finger? Or did you kill her, wrap her in a tarp, and throw her in the back like a sack of mulch?"
"No,"
Mathers whispered. He was shaking his head, but his eyes were fixed on the photo. He was trapped. The clip put her in the truck. The blood proved she died there. The Good Samaritan defense was dead on arrival. "We are testing the DNA right now," Thorne lied. He didn't know if they could get a profile, but Mathers didn't know that. "When it comes back to Julie Miller, the state of Texas is going to seek the death penalty. Not life. Death. You understand that? 2 girls. 2 murders. There is no mercy for that." Mathers began to weep. It wasn't the sobbing of a man sorry for his sins. It was the sobbing of a trapped animal. "It was an accident," he choked out.
She
started screaming too. Just like Sarah. Why do they always scream? I just wanted to talk to them. I just wanted them to like me. Where is she? Thorne slammed his hand on the table. Don't tell me it was an accident. Tell me where she is. The family deserves a body. You can't save yourself, Kenneth, but you can save your soul from rotting in hell a little less if you tell us where she is. The water. Mathers gasped. The water. The river? Thorne pressed. Did you put her in the river? No, Mathers sobbed. Not the river. The well. The old well on the property. Thorne froze. Which property? Your property. My grandfather's old place, Mathers whispered, defeated. Out on County Road 9. Nobody lives there. The well is dry. I put her down there. I threw rocks on top. I just wanted her to be quiet. Thorne stood up. His legs felt weak, but his resolve was iron. He had the location. He had the confession. The runaway was coming home. He walked out of the room, leaving the weeping killer alone with the ghosts of his victims. He walked into the bullpen, where the hum of activity stopped the moment they saw his face.
He didn't need to speak.
They knew. County Road 9, Thorne said, his voice ringing out. The old Mathers homestead. Look for a well. And bring the coroner. We're bringing Julie home. The scene shifts from the sterile police station back to the outdoors, but this time, the location is different. It is an overgrown, abandoned farmhouse on a dirt road that time forgot. The house is falling down, reclaimed by kudzu and ivy. In the backyard, hidden by tall grass, is a stone circle.
A well.
The police cars arrived in a convoy, lights flashing, cutting through the twilight. The team approached the well with reverence. They cleared the brush. They set up the lights. They looked down into the darkness. It was deep. It was black. It smelled of earth and time. A firefighter was lowered down on a winch, a bright yellow figure descending into the underworld. Thorne stood at the lip of the well, holding his breath. The radio crackled. "I see rocks." The firefighter's voice came through, tinny and distorted. "Lots of rocks. I'm moving them." Minutes passed. Agonizing, silent minutes. The only sound was the wind in the trees and the distant call of a crow. "Detective?" The voice on the radio was different now.
Softer. Sadder.
"Go ahead," Thorne said. "We have remains." "I see." "I see a shoe. A sneaker. A Converse." Thorne closed his eyes. Julie Miller had worn Converse. Every teenager in 2004 wore Converse. "Secure the scene," Thorne whispered. "Bring her up gently." As the news filtered back to the station, and then to the media, and then to the Miller family, the atmosphere in Vidor shifted again. The horror was absolute, but so was the relief. The not knowing was over. The question mark that had hung over Julie Miller's name for 20 years had been straightened into an exclamation point. But as Thorne watched the recovery team work into the night, a new, darker thought took root in his mind. He looked at the shoebox of photos still sitting on his desk in his mind's eye. 43 photos. 2 confirmed victims. Sarah Jenkins. Julie Miller. That left 41 windows. 41 other lives that Kenneth Mathers had invaded. Were they all just voyeurism? Were they all just watching? Or were there other wells? Other dry creeks? Other graves scattered across the vast, lonely landscape of East Texas? The arrest of Kenneth Mathers had solved 2 mysteries, but it had opened a Pandora's box of potential horrors. And as the first bone was brought up from the well, glowing white in the spotlight, Thorne knew that the work wasn't done. The pizza crust killer was a monster, yes, but monsters rarely stop at 2. The night was dark, but the truth was beginning to shine with a terrible, blinding light. And the truck, the rusted, silent blue beast, had delivered its final, damning payload. The recovery of Julie and Miller was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of profound, suffocating sorrow. As the winch whined in the darkness of the grandfather's homestead, pulling the basket up from the depths of the earth, the silence among the gathered officers was absolute. It was a silence that honored the 20 years she had spent in the dark, a silence that apologized for the time it took to find her. When the basket finally broke the surface, carrying the commingled debris of rocks, soil, and the fragmented remains of a girl who had once dreamed of becoming a nurse, a collective weight settled on the shoulders of every man and woman present. It was the weight of failure, not theirs specifically, but the failure of a world that allows such things to happen to the innocent. Thorne stood by the edge of the well, the harsh glare of the floodlights cutting deep shadows into his face. He watched as the medical examiner, a woman with hands as gentle as they were steady, transferred the remains into a body bag. There were the sneakers, dirty, rotted Converse high tops, just as the firefighter had said. There were scraps of denim. And there was the bone structure of a petite female, frozen in time at 16 years old. Thorne felt a burning in his throat that had nothing to do with the dust. He turned away, walking back toward his cruiser, the crunch of dry leaves under his boots sounding like gunshots in the quiet night. We got her, he thought. But we were 20 years late. Back at the station, the mood had shifted from adrenaline to a grim, methodical determination. The cold case unit was no longer a dusty corner of the basement. It was the nerve center of the entire department. The wall that had once held only Sarah Jenkins' photo was now a sprawling, chaotic map of terror. In the center was Kenneth Mathers' mugshot. To his left, Sarah. To his right, Julie. And surrounding them, like a constellation of potential horror, were the remaining 41 Polaroids. Thorne stood before the wall, a cup of stale coffee in his hand, staring at the windows. 41 windows. 41 lives interrupted by the gaze of a predator. The identification team had been working nonstop, fueled by energy drinks and dread. They had identified 15 of the houses. Most were confirmed as burglaries or prowler calls from the late 90s and early 2000s. But 26 photos remained nameless, grainy, dark images of siding, fences, and curtains that could be anywhere in East Texas. "We need to know," Thorne muttered to Alvarez, who was slumped in a chair, rubbing his eyes. "We need to know if he just watched or if he went inside." "He's not talking about the others," Alvarez replied, his voice raspy. "He gave us Julie to save his own skin from the death penalty, or so he thinks. He's shutting down on the rest. He says they're just scenery." Scenery. Thorne spat the word out. "You don't take pictures of scenery at 3 a.m. through a bedroom window." As the investigation ground on, the story of the pizza crust killer and the well on County Road 9 dominated the national news cycle. It was everywhere. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. The face of Kenneth Mathers was beamed into millions of living rooms. And in one of those living rooms, in a suburb of Houston, a woman named Rebecca sat freezing on her sofa, the remote control trembling in her hand. Rebecca was 42 now. She was a mother, a paralegal, a woman with a busy, normal life. But seeing Mather's face, that doughy, unremarkable face, triggered a trapdoor in her memory that she had nailed shut nearly 2 decades ago. She didn't know him as Kenneth. She didn't know him as a killer. She knew him as the man in the blue truck. It was 2002. She was 21, a college student driving home for Thanksgiving on a lonely stretch of Highway 96. A blue truck had come up behind her, its headlights blinding in her rearview mirror. It had tailgated her for miles. When she tried to change lanes, it swerved with her. When she sped up, it matched her. Panic had risen in her throat like bile. She remembered the terror of being hunted by a machine. And then, at a stop sign, the truck had pulled alongside her. The driver had rolled down his window. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't cursed. He had just looked at her. He had smiled, a slow, dead smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then he had laughed and peeled away, disappearing into the night. Rebecca had never reported it. It was just road rage, she had told herself. Just a jerk in a truck. But looking at the TV screen, at the eyes of the man who had murdered Sarah Jenkins and Julie Miller, she knew. It wasn't road rage. It was a selection process. She had been auditioned. And for some reason, maybe because she didn't look scared enough, or maybe because another car had come down the road, she had failed the audition. She picked up the phone. Her hands shook so hard she misdialed twice. When she finally got through to the Vidor tip line, her voice was barely a whisper. "I know him," she said. "He followed me." Thorne took the call himself. He listened to Rebecca's story, his pen scratching furiously across a notepad. The timeline fit perfectly. 2002, right between Sarah, 1998, and Julie, 2004. The vehicle fit, the blue Ford. But it was the detail about the smile that chilled him. It confirmed what he had suspected. Mathers enjoyed the fear. The killing was the climax, but the terror was the foreplay. "Can you come in?" Thorne asked. "I need you to look at something." Rebecca drove to Vidor the next morning. She walked into the station with the hesitancy of someone entering a funeral home. Thorne met her in the lobby. He didn't take her to the interrogation room. He took her to a quiet office. He laid out the remaining unidentified photos. "Take your time," Thorne said gently. "Do you recognize anything?" Rebecca scanned the blurry Polaroids. She shook her head at the first few. A brick wall, a hedge, a swing set. Then she stopped. Her finger hovered over photo number 29. It was a picture of a car. A silver Honda Civic, parked under a carport. The license plate was obscured by the flash, but there was a sticker on the back bumper. A university parking permit. "That's my car," Rebecca whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "That was my car in college."
That
sticker. "I put that on my freshman year." Thorne leaned in. Where was this taken, Rebecca? My apartment, she said, tears welling up in her eyes. In Beaumont. I lived on the ground floor. My carport was right outside my bedroom window. The implication hit them both like a physical blow. The encounter on the highway hadn't been random. He hadn't just found her on the road. He had been following her. He had been to her home. He had stood outside her bedroom window, taken a picture of her car as a souvenir, and then waited for her on the highway. The road rage incident wasn't an encounter. It was an attempted abduction. He was hunting you, Thorne said, his voice grim. He was waiting for the right moment. And when he couldn't get you out of the car or when he got spooked, he let you go. Rebecca began to sob. He was there. He was outside my window while I was sleeping. Yes, Thorne said. But you're here, Rebecca. You survived. And because you survived, you just gave us the link we needed. Rebecca's identification of photo 29 was the key that unlocked the pattern. Mathers wasn't just an opportunist who grabbed girls he saw on the street. He was a stalker of the highest order. He selected targets, learned their routines, photographed their environments, and then struck. Sarah Jenkins. He had delivered her appliance. Julie Miller. He had watched her house. Rebecca. He had followed her from campus. This changed the interrogation strategy completely. Mathers was presenting himself as a man with urges that occasionally got out of control. But the photos proved premeditation. They proved a campaign of terror that spanned decades. Thorne knew he had to go back in. He had to break Mathers' narrative of the accidental killer. Thorne entered the interview room with a new energy. Mathers was eating a sandwich, seemingly resigned to his fate. He looked up, chewing slowly. Rebecca says hello, Thorne said, dropping the photo of the silver Honda on the table. Mathers stopped chewing. He swallowed hard. Who? The girl in the silver Honda, Thorne said. The one you followed on Highway 96 in 2002. The one you tried to run off the road. You took a picture of her car, Kenneth. You were at her apartment in Beaumont. You were going to take her, weren't you? Mathers stared at the photo. The color drained from his face. He remembered Rebecca. She was the one that got away. The one who had driven too fast, who had been too alert. He had been furious that night. He had gone home and punched a hole in his trailer wall. I don't know what you're talking about, Mathers mumbled, but the conviction was gone. We have her statement, Thorne pressed. She identified the car. She identified you. She identified the truck. You're not just a murderer, Kenneth. You're a serial predator. You have a type. You have a method. And I'm going to find every single woman in this box. Thorne leaned across the table, his eyes boring into Mathers. How many, Kenneth? How many times did you try and fail? And how many times did you succeed, and we just haven't found them yet? Mathers closed his eyes. He was beginning to realize that the box was not just a collection of trophies. It was a dossier of his own damnation. Every photo was a witness. Every window was an accusation. I didn't kill her, Mathers whispered. She got away. She got away, Thorne repeated. But who didn't? Look at photo number 41, Kenneth. Thorne slid another picture across the table. This one was different. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a car. It was a picture of a wooded area, taken in daylight. In the center of the frame, half buried in leaves, was a piece of fabric. A red scarf. We found this in the box, Thorne said. It's not a trophy of a house. It's a trophy of a site. Where is this, Kenneth? Who owned the red scarf? Mathers' eyes snapped open. He looked at the photo of the scarf, and a spasm of genuine panic crossed his face. This wasn't a near miss like Rebecca. This wasn't a runaway like Julie. This was something else. Something he had kept hidden even from himself. I found it, Mathers stammered. I just found it in the woods. It doesn't mean anything. You don't take pictures of trash, Thorne said, echoing his earlier sentiment. You take pictures of memories. Whose memory is this? The room went silent. The air crackled with tension. Mathers was cornered. He had confessed to Sarah and Julie because the physical evidence was overwhelming. But the red scarf? That was a ghost he thought had vanished completely. It was a hiker, Mathers whispered, so softly Thorne almost missed it. She was hiking near the dam. 1999. Thorne felt a chill that started at the base of his spine and radiated outward. 1999, a year after Sarah. 5 years before Julie. A gap in the timeline that had bothered him. A hiker, Thorne said, keeping his voice steady, coaxing the monster out of the cave. Did you talk to her? She asked for directions, Mather said, staring at the red scarf in the photo. She was lost. She was from out of state. Nobody knew she was there. And, Thorne prompted. And, I showed her a shortcut, Mather said. A tear leaked out of his eye, tracking through the grime on his cheek. I showed her the shortcut to the water. Thorne closed his eyes for a brief second. Another one. A stranger. A tourist. Someone who probably wasn't even reported missing in Texas. Someone whose family was waiting in Ohio or Florida or Maine, wondering why she never came home from her cross-country trip. What was her name, Kenneth? I don't know, Mathers wept. I never asked. She had a red scarf. It was pretty. Thorne stood up. He felt sick. He felt the enormity of the evil sitting across from him. It wasn't just a crime spree. It was a life dedicated to the destruction of others. The pizza crust had been the thread, but pulling it had unraveled the entire tapestry of a madman's life. We're going to the dam, Thorne said to the mirror. And we're going to check the missing persons database for 1999. Look for a hiker. Look for a red scarf. As he walked out, Thorne knew that the solved stamp on the Sarah Jenkins file was just the beginning. They were no longer solving a cold case. They were excavating a graveyard. The pizza crust killer was a misnomer. This was the work of a man who had turned the backroads of Vidor into his personal hunting ground for 30 years. And the red scarf was just the next marker on the trail of the dead. The flashing lights of the ambulance fade into the harsh, antiseptic glare of the ICU. Arthur Thorne didn't die at the old mill. He survived the crush, shattered but breathing, clinging to life with the same stubborn arrogance that allowed him to strangle the truth for 30 years. He is handcuffed to the bed rails, a broken king in a gown of paper and cotton. Outside his room, 2 state troopers stand guard. Not local police. State. The distinction is critical. Sarah Jenkins made sure of that. She sits in the waiting room, holding a cup of vending machine coffee that tastes like burnt plastic. Her arm is in a sling. Her face is a map of lacerations and bruises, stitched together by a tired ER resident. But she is awake. She is vibrantly, fiercely awake. Across from her sits Captain Miller from the fire station. He is holding a teddy bear, Mr. Paws. He hasn't let it go since Emily ran into his arms. The bear looks ridiculous in his soot-stained hands, but to Jenkins, it looks like the crown jewels. The feds are on their way, Miller says quietly, leaning in. I called the number you gave me. Special Agent Ross. He says he remembers the Vance case. Says he always thought it smelled wrong. Ross is good, Jenkins nods. He was the one who tried to audit the department in '98. Thorne shut him down. Ross has been waiting for this. But before the FBI can arrive, the shark enters the tank. District Attorney Miles Sterling walks into the waiting room. He is immaculate. Press suit, perfect hair, the picture of concern. He spots Jenkins. He rushes over, his face a mask of relief. Sarah, thank God, he says, reaching out as if to hug her. She doesn't stand. She doesn't flinch. She just stares at him. He stops, his hands hovering awkwardly. I heard what happened.
Thorne, my God.
To think he was playing us all this time. You're a hero, Sarah. A true hero. Save the speech, Miles, Jenkins says, her voice rasping. She is done with the theater. I know you called him. I know you told him to contain me. Sterling's smile falters. Just for a second. The politician's mask slips, revealing the calculator underneath. He looks around the room. It's crowded with nurses and families. He lowers his voice. I was trying to de-escalate, Sarah. I didn't know he was going to kidnap your mother. I thought he was just going to talk to you. I was trying to protect the department from a scandal. You were protecting yourself, she counters. You signed off on the unfounded complaints against him. You took his endorsements during your election. You rode his clearance rate to the DA's office. You built your career on his lies. Sterling's eyes harden. Be careful, detective. You have the killer. You have Thorne. Don't overreach. If you try to burn the whole house down, you might get caught in the flames.
We can close this neatly.
Thorne goes down for Vance. You get a promotion. We heal the community. Why drag the mud through the halls of justice? He is offering her a deal. The devil at the crossroads. Give him Thorne, but leave the system intact. Jenkins looks at the teddy bear in Miller's lap. She thinks of Elena Vance, bleeding out on a kitchen floor because she refused to make a deal. She thinks of Frank Donnelly, burning in his own bar because he finally found his courage. I'm not interested in a promotion, Miles, she says softly. I'm interested in the ledger. The ledger? Sterling feigns ignorance. What ledger? The one inside the bear, she says, pointing to the toy. The one Elena died for. The one that lists every kickback, every laundered dollar, and every politician who took a cut of the drug money, including the consulting fees paid to your law firm in 1995. Sterling goes pale. It is a subtle shift like milk souring.
He looks at the bear.
He looks at Captain Miller, who shifts his bulk, crossing his massive arms. Miller isn't a man you can intimidate. You don't have that, Sterling whispers. That's a bluff. Is it? Jenkins smiles. It's a dangerous smile. Agent Ross will be here in 10 minutes. Why don't we open it together and see? Sterling stares at her. He realizes the game has changed. He isn't dealing with a subordinate anymore. He is dealing with a wrecking ball. He straightens his tie. He regains his composure. I see, he says coldly.
Well,
I hope you have a good lawyer, Sarah. Because procedures were violated. Evidence was mishandled. Chains of custody were broken. A good defense attorney, Thorne's attorney, will tear this apart. The bear? Inadmissible. Fruit of the poisonous tree. Let them try, she says. The court of public opinion is already in session. I sent a copy of the ledger to the Times before I came here. She didn't. It's a lie. But it's the kind of lie Thorne would have told. She learned from the master. Sterling flinches. The threat of the press is the only gun he fears. He turns on his heel. He walks away without another word. He pulls out his phone as he exits the sliding doors. He is calling his fixer. He is calling his lawyer. He is running. 10 minutes later, the cavalry arrives. Not in horses, but in black SUVs. The FBI team sweeps into the hospital. Special Agent Ross, a man with a face carved from granite, shakes Jenkins' hand. He takes custody of the bear. He takes custody of Thorne's room. We'll take it from here, Detective, Ross says. You rest. You've done enough. But she doesn't rest. She can't. The next few months are a blur of depositions, grand juries, and media storms. The Vance case explodes onto the national stage. It is the story of the decade. The hero cop who is a monster. The headlines are relentless. Thorne recovers enough to stand trial. He sits in the courtroom in a wheelchair, a blanket over his crushed legs. He has lost weight. He looks small, diminished, but his eyes are still sharp. He stares at Jenkins when she takes the stand. He tries to intimidate her one last time. She recounts everything. The warning stop, the missing drugs, the kidnapping, the confession at the mill. Her voice is steady. She doesn't cry. She tells the story for Elena, for Mark, for Holloway, for Donnelly. The defense tries to paint her as unstable. They bring up her renegade actions. They bring up the shooting in the precinct. But then, the prosecution plays the tape. Not a tape from 1994. A tape from the hospital. Jenkins had been wearing a wire when Sterling visited her in the waiting room. The FBI had wired her up before she even sat down. Ross had been in the van outside. The jury listens to Sterling trying to cut a deal. They listen to him admit he knew about the corruption. It is the nail in the coffin. Not just for Thorne, but for the administration. The verdict comes back in 4 hours.
Guilty.
First-degree murder.
Kidnapping.
Racketeering. Extortion. Thorne doesn't react. He just nods, as if he expected it. As if he's bored. He is wheeled out of the courtroom. As he passes Jenkins, he stops. "You think you won," he whispers.
But look at this town, Sarah.
They don't trust the badge anymore. I kept the order. You brought the chaos. You didn't save Blackwood. You broke it. It was already broken, Arthur, she replies, looking down at him. I just turned on the lights so we could see the cracks. He is taken away. The doors close. The applause from the gallery is deafening, but Jenkins doesn't hear it. She feels a hand on her shoulder. It's Emily, now 7 years old, holding a new teddy bear. Is the bad man gone, Mommy? Yes, baby. He's gone. But Thorne was right about one thing. The town is broken. The trust is gone. The police department is gutted. Half the force is under investigation. The chief resigns. Sterling is indicted. The community looks at every uniform with suspicion. Jenkins walks out onto the courthouse steps. The microphones are thrust in her face. Detective. Detective. Will you run for sheriff? Detective, how do you feel? She looks at the sea of cameras. She looks at the sign on the police station across the square. To protect and serve. She reaches into her pocket. She pulls out her badge. The gold shield she polished every morning for 10 years. She looks at it. It feels heavy. It feels like it belongs to a different life. No comment, she says. She walks through the crowd, holding her daughter's hand. She walks to her car. She drives away. She drives to the cemetery. It is quiet there. The wind rustles the leaves of the oak trees. She finds the grave. Elena Vance. Beloved wife.
Teacher.
Friend. Next to it is a new marker. Mark Vance. Finally home. Jenkins fought to have his remains exhumed from the woods and buried properly. She cleared his name. His parents were there for the ceremony, weeping with gratitude. She stands there for a long time. The sun begins to set, casting long shadows. I did it, she whispers to the stone. I finished the lesson. She leaves a single white rose on the grave. She gets back in her car. She doesn't go back to the station. She drives home. She packs a bag. She isn't a detective anymore. She can't be. Not in a town where the shadows have names she knows. She needs a fresh start. She needs to be just Sarah. But as she drives out of Blackwood, passing the welcome sign that now feels like a warning label, her phone rings. It's a number she doesn't recognize. Area code 202. Washington, D.C. Sarah Jenkins? Speaking. This is Director Holloway of the FBI. No relation to Jim. We've been watching the trial. We saw how you handled the encryption on that ledger. We saw how you handled the field op. And we think you're wasted in a small town. We have a cold case division at Quantico. We deal with the cases nobody else wants. The ones that are buried deep. We could use a hunter like you. Jenkins looks at Emily in the rearview mirror. Emily is asleep. She looks at the road ahead. It is dark, but the headlights cut a clear path. I'm not a cop anymore, she says. We don't need a cop, the director says. We need someone who knows how to kill monsters. What do you say? Jenkins smiles. It is the first real, genuine smile she has felt in months. I say, tell me where to report. Fade out. The car drives into the horizon. The music swells, hopeful, but with a lingering minor chord of melancholy. The screen fades to black. Silence for 3 seconds. Epilogue narration begins.
Soft.
Reflective.
Haunting.
30 years. It took 30 years for the wind to carry the truth home. The house on Elm Street is gone, replaced by a park. A swing set stands where the kitchen used to be. Children play there now, their laughter chasing away the ghosts. But if you listen closely on a stormy night, when the wind howls through the pines of Route 9, you can still hear the echo of the gavel. Justice is not a straight line. It is a jagged scar. It heals, but the tissue is never the same. Arthur Thorne died in prison 3 years into a sentence, a heart attack in a cell. Alone. Unmourned. The man who wanted to be a god died a number. And Sarah Jenkins? She never stopped looking. Because she knew the truth that Thorne tried to hide. The coldest cases aren't the ones without clues. They're the ones where the clues lead to the places we are too afraid to look. The file is closed. The box is sealed. But the watchman never sleeps.
Good night.
The world moved on, but for the town of Blackwood, the closure felt more like a collapse. The trial was over. The headlines had faded, and the television crews had packed up their vans and moved on to the next tragedy. But behind the reinforced glass and the razor wire of the state penitentiary, the story was entering its final, most chilling chapter. Arthur Thorne didn't go into the night quietly. Even in a jumpsuit, stripped of his sidearm and his authority, he remained the architect of the town's psyche. He sat in a cell no larger than the kitchen where he had taken Elena Vance's life. He was a man of routine. He spent his days writing. Not letters of apology, not appeals for mercy, but memoirs. A detailed, clinical record of every secret he had ever buried. He called it the Ledger of the Law. It was his final insurance policy. He knew that while he was behind bars, the men he had protected, the judges, the councilmen, the other officers who had looked the other way, were still out there, breathing the fresh air he would never touch again. And he intended to make them choke on it. Back in the world of the living, Sarah Jenkins found that the transition to the FBI wasn't the clean break she had imagined. The ghosts of Blackwood followed her to Quantico. Every case file she opened, every cold case she analyzed, she saw the fingerprint of Thorne. She realized that he wasn't an anomaly, he was a symptom. She spent her nights in a small apartment in Virginia, the walls covered not in family photos, but in the sprawling web of the Thorne network. She had taken a copy of the ledger before the feds had fully classified it. She knew there were names in there that hadn't been called to the stand.
Names that sat in high offices in Washington.
The protector, Elena Vance, had discovered wasn't just a local cop. It was a pipeline of corruption that stretched far beyond the borders of a small suburban town. Community shock was an understatement. The Blackwood Police Department was eventually disbanded, replaced by a regional task force. The old station, the place where Thorne had held court, was gutted and turned into a community center. They tried to scrub the stain, but you can't wash away a haunting with fresh paint. One evening, 6 months after the sentencing, Jenkins received a package. No return address. Inside was a single cassette tape.
Old. Analog.
She played it. The sound of rain. The rhythmic slapping of windshield wipers. And then a voice. May 12, 1994. 11:45 p.m. It was Thorne's voice, recorded on his personal dictaphone, a device the police had never found. I pulled her over. She thinks she's being brave. She showed me the photos she took at the high school. She saw the crates. She knows about the blue velvet. She's giving me 24 hours to make it right before she goes to the feds. She's a fool. She thinks the law is a shield. She doesn't realize it's a sword, and I'm the one holding the hilt. The tape hissed. Then a chilling silence. I'm going to her house on the 14th. Mark will be in the city. It has to be clean. It has to be a tragedy. People love a tragedy. They'll be too busy crying to ask who bought the handkerchiefs. Jenkins felt a cold sweat break across her neck. The tape wasn't just a confession, it was a taunt. Thorne had mailed it from prison. He wanted her to know that even though she had won, he was still the narrator. He was showing her the scenes she had missed, the dialogue she couldn't have known. He was forcing her to relive the murder through his eyes. She realized then that Thorne's greatest crime wasn't the murder of Elena Vance. It was the murder of the town's belief in the light. He had proven that the monster could be the man who gave you a speeding warning and a smile. He had turned every shadow into a potential predator wearing a badge. The impact on the community was a lingering rot. Property values in Blackwood plummeted. Families moved away, unable to walk past the park where the Vance house once stood, without feeling the air grow cold. The strange clue that Jenkins had followed, the GPS log, the gun, the key, had led to a truth so heavy it threatened to sink the town. But there was a final piece of the puzzle, a detail Thorne had kept until the very end. Jenkins visited him. One last time. She sat behind the glass. Thorne looked older, his hair a shock of white, his eyes sunken but burning with a malicious intelligence. "Why the tape, Arthur?" she asked. "Because you were the only one who deserved to hear it," he whispered. "The others, they just wanted a villain. You wanted the truth. And the truth is, Sarah, Elena wasn't the first.
And she won't be the last."
"What are you talking about?" "The woods behind the old mill," Thorne said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You were so focused on Mark. You were so focused on Elena. Did you ever wonder why I chose that spot for the final showdown? Did you ever wonder why the soil there is so rich?" Jenkins felt the floor drop out. "How many, Arthur?" "The ledger only has the names of the living, Sarah. The dead don't need an accounting. Check the ground under the third pylon. The girl from the 1989 disappearance? The one the department said ran away? She's there. She's been there for 27 years, waiting for someone to notice the cracks." He leaned back, the chains on his wrists clinking. "I didn't just kill people, detective. I curated a collection. I was the keeper of the town's darkest secrets. And now I'm giving them to you. You wanted my job? You got it. You're the watchman now. Enjoy the view." He stood up and walked away, the guards trailing behind him like shadows. Jenkins walked out of the prison into a bright, blinding sun. She felt sick. The case wasn't a cold case anymore. It was a mass grave. The Being Cold Case 3 Thap KY was just the tip of a spear that went back decades. She called Agent Ross. She told him about the pylon. She told him to bring the ground-penetrating radar. The ensuing weeks saw the old mill become a crime scene again. They found them. 3 bodies. 3 girls whose files had been marked runaway by Sergeant Arthur Thorne. He hadn't just been a corrupt cop or a murderer. He was a serial predator who had used the badge as his hunting license. He had used his position to ensure that no one ever looked for the victims because the man in charge of the search was the man who had buried them. The shock was absolute. It wasn't just a community in shock. It was a nation. The hero cop was now the Blackwood Butcher. Jenkins stood at the edge of the excavation site. She watched as the forensic teams carefully brushed away the dirt from the remains of the 1989 victim. A small, tarnished locket was found near the ribs. Inside was a photo of a mother and daughter. The haunting memories that remained in the community weren't just of Elena Vance anymore. They were of every child who had ever waved to a patrol car and felt safe. They were of every parent who had trusted the police to find their missing daughter. The betrayal was total. Jenkins looked at her hands. They were shaking. She realized that by catching Thorne, she hadn't ended the nightmare. She had simply opened the door to the basement and showed the world how many bodies were in the dark. She looked up at the sky. The clouds were gathering again. A storm was coming. It felt appropriate. "We're not done," she whispered to the wind. "We're never done." Fade out. The sound of a shovel hitting earth. Over and over. A rhythmic, hollow thud that sounds like a heartbeat fading into the distance. The excavation at the old mill lasted through the winter. The world watched in a collective, horrified silence as the soil gave up the secrets Arthur Thorne had guarded with his life. Each body recovered was a new headline, a new scar on the soul of a nation, and a new weight on the shoulders of Sarah Jenkins. She didn't return to Quantico. She couldn't leave yet. She stayed in a small motel room, the same one where she had once hidden with Emily, watching the black bags being carried out of the woods. The cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a testament to the absolute power of a silent badge. But the final blow didn't come from the earth. It came from the mail. 1 week before the 3rd anniversary of Thorne's conviction, a final letter arrived at the FBI field office, addressed to Jenkins. It was postmarked the day Arthur Thorne's heart finally stopped in that cold, concrete cell. It was his final move on the board, a dead man's hand. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, yellowed with age, and a key to a safe deposit box in a bank that had changed names 3 times since 1994. The photo was of a young Arthur Thorne, standing next to a man whose face was blurred by a flare of light. They were standing in front of the Blackwood City Hall. On the back, in Thorne's precise, arrogant script, were 3 words, the foundation stone. Jenkins went to the bank. Her hands didn't shake this time. They were numb. She opened the box. Inside was no ledger, no drugs, and no money. There was only a single, leather-bound diary belonging to the man who had been the police chief when Thorne was a rookie, the man who had mentored Thorne, just as Thorne had tried to mentor her. She read it in the silence of the vault. It wasn't a diary of crimes. It was a diary of a philosophy. It detailed a secret society within the department, a brotherhood called the Sentinels. They believed that to protect the sheepdogs had to be allowed to hunt. They believed that a certain amount of controlled evil was necessary to prevent total chaos. Thorne hadn't been a lone monster. He was the prize pupil of a cult of authority that had existed in Blackwood for 50 years. The realization was the ultimate deadlock. How do you arrest a shadow? How do you prosecute a ghost? Jenkins walked out into the cold morning air. She looked at the city of Blackwood, and for the first time, she didn't see a town. She saw a graveyard of ideals. The lingering shock over the years hadn't just been about the murders. It was the realization that the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to, protecting the powerful and consuming the weak. She took the diary to the only person she could trust. Not a cop, not a fed. She took it to the families of the victims. She sat in a church basement with the mothers of the girls from the mill, with Elena's aging father, and with the widow of Jim Halloway. She laid the book on the table. "I can't give you justice in a courtroom for this," Jenkins told them, her voice thick with an emotional climax 3 decades in the making. "The men who started this are dead, or beyond the law. But I can give you the truth. We publish this. We put every name, every date, and every controlled evil on the front page of every paper in the country. We don't let them hide behind the badge anymore." The community rally was quiet, but it was powerful. They didn't march, they stood. Thousands of people, holding candles, lining the streets from the old mill to the steps of City Hall. They didn't chant, they just whispered the names of the dead. It was an exorcism. The haunting memories remaining in the community began to shift. The fear of the Blackwood butcher was replaced by the fierce, protective love of a town that had finally looked at its own reflection and refused to blink. The cold case was finally, truly over. Sarah Jenkins stood on the hill overlooking the town one last time. Emily was beside her, now a young woman with her mother's eyes, the eyes of a hunter, but also the eyes of a healer. "Is it done, Mom?" Emily asked. Jenkins looked at the horizon, where the sun was struggling to break through the persistent gray clouds. She thought of Elena's wine glass. She thought of Halloway's rusted gun. She thought of Thorne's final, mocking smile in the prison glass. "The case is closed, Em," Jenkins said, her voice is steady, cinematic resonance. "But the watch never ends. We don't just find the bodies. We make sure no one else gets buried in the dark." She reached into her pocket and felt the cold brass of a new badge, one that didn't represent a town or a department, but a promise. A promise that the truth, no matter how cold, no matter how buried, will always find its way to the light. The music swells, a final, soaring chord that carries the weight of 30 years. The camera pulls back, higher and higher, until the town of Blackwood is just a small cluster of lights in a vast, dark world. The rain stops. The clouds break. And for the first time in 3 decades, the sun shines on the old mill. Fade to black. Final text on screen, dedicated to the families of the disappeared. The truth is never truly cold. The sound of a single, soft footstep on dry leaves. Then silence.